one thing that interests me, maybe we can kind of move into this, is so understanding this history, I think, as far as pagan and then Christianity kind of conquering this darkness of paganism in the West, and reaching its high point. Now it seems to be on this downward trajectory, right? And then this paganism is coming back from the ashes, because it's really the only other alternative is the thesis. And I agree.
And it never goes away. Like paganism never Christianity conquered it, but it's always there, right? And just to be clear, since we're on a Christian podcast, the reason it's always there is because like the devil and the fallen angels are still there. They were cast down from heaven. They're here now. They're not going to go away until all things are made new, right? The pagan gods, and this was something the ancient Mesopotamians believed, and the ancient Israelites also believed, was that these pagan gods weren't just like constructions.
Yes,
they're real beings, like they exist, and they have real power, right? So that's the other reason that like paganism doesn't go away, because the objects of pagan worship have not gone away. They're real, and they are still here.
Welcome back to On the Line. We hope you're doing well, and we hope you're as excited as we are about this interview. We've got John D. Davidson, who he's recently been on Tucker Carlson. He's been on Pints with Aquinas, a lot of other platforms, because the book that he's just come out with, Pagan America, is a monumental and profound work that really all Christians should both read, but understand these concepts that he's introducing. He put his finger on the pulse of what is going on here in the U.S. and in the Western world, and how it relates to the downfall of Christianity and this diabolical type of replacement that's taking place. So very excited about this interview. John D. Davidson has just a great conversationalist and guest, so we hope that you enjoy this. As always, if you can like this video, subscribe, share this with individuals that you think that this message would help them understand both the Christian faith and things that are going on. It would be a great help for the different goals that you and I are working on. So enjoy this, and God bless. All right, Bennett says we're live. Welcome back, guys. And today we've got John D. Davidson. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, we've got a lot of stuff to talk about here.
Yes,
let me just pull your book up here. So just for the listeners, this interview is going to be, I'm very much looking forward to it. Very important. I just want to highlight right at the beginning the book. So we have you on, John. You just wrote this book, Pagan America. I'll just kind of hold it up here. I highly recommend reading this. It's one of the best books I've read recently. And it's basically for anyone who's coming from a Christian perspective and asks the question, what's going on in the world, right? You just see, I mean, as the picture looks like, there's a fire, right? There's chaos around in all of these different areas, whether it's things on the technology front, things on the cultural front, confusion at what's going on in churches, both left-leaning and even the churches that historically aren't normally left-leaning, right? And I think what you do is you put a good thread throughout all of that and put your finger on the pulse. So if someone really wants to just understand what's going on, this interview is going to be a great introduction, but also this book is really going to just dive in deep. So very much excited to unpack this. So John, why don't you just say kind of what your thesis is, what led you to write this book, a little bit about yourself.
Sure. The basic argument of the book is that there's only one alternative to Christianity, and that's paganism. It also argues at the outset that America was founded as a Christian nation, and that the kind of country that our founders thought they were creating, the system of government and the nation itself, would only be possible with a Christian people. And I argue and make a case that they said as much over and over again, that a republic of self-governing citizens is only possible with a certain kind of people, a predominantly Christian people, right? And that all of the things that we associate with our government and our way of life in America, freedom of speech, free exercise of religion, consent of the governed, rule by law, freedom of assembly, all of those things, right? They depend for their sustenance, for their vitality, on a Christian ethos alive and active among the people, right? And that in turn depends on the people actually being Christians and practicing their Christianity, right? Not abstract adherence to sort of Enlightenment principles, right? The Enlightenment principles themselves are not the source of their own legitimacy. They rely on theological claims in Christianity about the human person, about our relationship to God and our relationship to one another. So all that said, as America becomes post-Christian, we will cease to be the same kind of country and the same kind of society that we have been through most of our history up until about the middle of the last century. And something else will replace that. And what that something else is not secular, like liberal utopia. It's not a sort of rationalist, materialist, atheistic worldview. What will replace it is a new form of paganism and the return of the pagan ethos. And the pagan ethos is exemplified by a kind of radical moral subjectivity and a radical subjective cosmology about what human beings are, about how we should organize society, and the way of organizing a society according to the pagan ethos is not one that's based on transcendent, universal moral precepts about the equality of all men who are made in the image of God, but of one based on force and coercion, a rule of the powerful over and against the weak by right. That has been the pattern of pagan societies all through history. And I argue that we're going to return to that form as we enter this post-Christian era.
Yeah. And I know we're going to take some time to unpack what that means, because I've talked a little bit with even just people in the church or even some of the kids I'm teaching at seniors about that concept. And pagan, just that word is very foreign to them. Some people say, well, what do you mean by pagan?
Right.
So we'll spend some time on that. But first, if you can just kind of highlight what you mean by, because most people think, well, we're just going secular, right? And this is some kind of new experience. What do you mean by that? What do people have in mind when they're thinking about that? And why is that the wrong direction for where things are actually going?
Right. So the idea of secularism was actually a creation of Christian civilization itself, right? The separation between secular power and sacred power in Catholic Europe. The Pope having his sphere of authority in matters of religion and faith, and the Emperor having his sphere of secular or earthly authority in matters of state. And so we in America, though, have adopted this notion of a separation between church and state, a wall of separation between church and state, in Thomas Jefferson's sort of infamous phrase. And I argue that we have misunderstood that phrase, beginning, again, about the middle of the last century. And prior to that, our understanding of the separation between church and state was that the reason that you needed to separate church and state in America and have these separate spheres was not to protect the state from the church or from religious belief, but to protect the church from the state. Right? The founders were operating in a time when they were looking back at the previous generations in Europe and the terrible religious wars that had torn Europe apart, and they were trying to figure out a way to not have that happen in the republic that they were trying to found. And what they landed on was that America would be non-sectarian but broadly religious, and the idea that the public square was supposed to be this totally neutral space, this totally secular space, and that religion and faith were supposed to be matters purely of the private sphere is a totally new and very much a departure from the way that most Americans understood this through most of our history, right? Even the founders themselves made provision for religious expressions and the support of religion in the public square and even in public policy right from the beginning. And one example I talk about in the book is the first Congress appropriating public funds for a chaplain for Congress before they ratified the First Amendment, right? And so in their minds, something like using public expenditures for a chaplain for Congress, which anyone today, even Christians today, because we've sort of accepted this like this misreading of Jefferson's separation of church and state would say, like, oh, that's establishment of religion. Well, the founders clearly didn't think it was establishment of religion. Not only that, but at the time of the ratification of the First Amendment, most of the 13 states had religious establishments at the state level, and some at even more local levels than the state level. So it wasn't that establishment of religion by a public authority was per se, anathema to the idea of American constitutionalism. It was that they did not want a national establishment that would supersede the state establishment. There was not going to be a national church, right? They understood that because of the religious diversity that already existed in America, that was going to invite sectarian conflict, the very thing that they wanted to avoid. So you have a non-sectarian constitution governing, binding together these states, one that was sort of neutral with respect to like denominationalism, but that incorporated into it political entities that were themselves religious, right? That were organized along religious lines, along theological lines, right? From the Anglicans in South Carolina to the Quakers in Pennsylvania. There's very stark denominational religious differences between all these different groups of Americans. And those establishments, those state establishments, they persisted well into the 19th century. And it was no act of the Supreme Court or some conflict with the Constitution that got rid of those establishments. It was just a normal political process. And they all kind of got rid of them at different times and in different ways. So I think one sort of revision that I argue for in this book is we need to sort of rethink our acceptance of this misreading of Jefferson's separation of church and state, and understand that what the founders thought they were doing was something different than what we started to do in the middle of the 20th century, and that we indeed were established as a republic, yes, but a Christian republic.
Yeah. Two thoughts there. I mean, one, you can see that because one point I really want to get into that you talk about in the book is that in many ways, the Christian groups in America have supported this, what you could call secular type move, or really it's kind of a move back towards paganism, as we'll get to. But we've supported this, and it's because we bought into this notion, right? So we've, I think you mentioned, for instance, Kennedy, right? When he was elected, there was this big pushback that he was Catholic. And he said, no, I won't let my Catholicism, affect how I run as a president, which makes no sense, because if you're really Catholic or you're really Christian, then that's going to be the most important ethos that will inform how you communicate with people, what kind of legislation you would want to pass, what your views on abortion, things like that would be.
Totally.
So this idea that even as a Christian, we have to take our views and put those on the side, because the real important thing is what's only secular, right? Which is completely removed from the religious. So in supporting that, that's kind of which brings up the second point, which is you make me think that this secular movement is really just this buying into this notion that important things happen outside of the church.
Yes.
Unimportant and personal things happen within the church. So this idea is, well, we're moving in this great direction. It has nothing to do with our Christian heritage.
Right.
And therefore, we're just going to continue on this great kind of trajectory as we shed our Christianity. And that's your point, is there's a wolf in sheep's clothing that's waiting there as we kind of make those movements.
It's a disfigurement of liberty, right? It's saying that like human freedom and liberty has like no object, right? When that is not how the founders understood liberty. That's not how Christians throughout the ages have understood liberty, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The founders did not think that the pursuit of happiness, that phrase, was a sort of libertarian creed that like you just live and let live, and you do you, and whatever makes you happy, you should be able to pursue. That's not what they thought by that. They understood the pursuit of happiness was the pursuit of virtue, and the cultivation and the acquisition of moral virtue. That was what created happiness, right? And so you were, as Pope St. John Paul II said, and I quote him in here, that that liberty or freedom is not the freedom to do what you like, but the freedom to do what you ought. Yeah. Right. That's what freedom is for. In other words, it has an object to it, right? And so you have a situation where only a people that understands that is fit to govern themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to have this kind of like this form of government, and also to have a public square where you can have things like tolerance,
Mm-hmm.
where you can have freedom of speech, right? And free exercise of religion, because it is and I say this over and over again, that those things, freedom of speech, tolerance, a neutral public square, those are luxury goods
Mm-hmm.
that only a Christian society can afford,
Mm-hmm.
right? You don't see those kinds of things in any other society. And you also can't divorce those things from the moral and theological, claims of which they are a source, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, the idea of freedom of speech. Like, why would a Christian society have something like freedom of speech, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, because we have this connected idea that there can be, you can't forcibly convert people. You can't
Mm-hmm.
coerce them into believing the truth, right? That has to be something that they arrive at on their own.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because human beings have equal dignity and equality before God. Why? Because we're created in the image and likeness of God, right?
Mm-hmm.
So these are all theological claims, right, that work themselves out. The working out of these theological claims gives us these different things, like the idea of a tolerance and free speech and a neutral public square. So those things don't subsist on their own. They rely on a Christian worldview, and thinking that we can divorce the two and we can just have sort of enlightened humanism,
Mm-hmm.
or like secular liberalism that will just infinitely go on under its own power is a big mistake. It is a result of a very cabined cosmological view
Mm-hmm.
that gained popularity, in the middle of the 20th century. And there was this brief window where you had materialists and secularists and you still do, Steven Pinker and Richard Dawkins types saying, why can't we have Christless Christianity? Why can't we have the culture without the cult,
Mm-hmm.
right? You can for a little while, but eventually the culture begins to wither and die, cut off from the source of its vitality. And that's what we're seeing right now.
Yeah. Yeah. It's two things. Again, one thing that I think my mind is very much shifted on, and I'm trying to find the right way to articulate, and maybe, this podcast and conversation will help make that same shift for people. But this understanding that the kind of things that we believe as Christians that we would say, well, that's just, of course, right? We'd say, well, that's just how it is. That is completely abnormal from human history, right? So this understanding of human rights, right? Or that we should care for the poor.
Yep.
We would say, and people even outside of the church, right? Everyone says, well, of course we should care for the poor.
Yeah.
That's shifting, and you make some of those points in your book. But for the most part, that's an obvious truth. But historically, that's not the case.
And the reason anyone says that nowadays, like that a non-Christian would say that nowadays, is that that's an inheritance from Christianity. It's the last vestiges of Christian morality that are still active in the imagination of the American people, right? Mm-hmm. It's why you have kind of a vocabulary problem here, because people are still invoking these ideas about, marginalized voices, right? Mm-hmm. We hear this on the left a lot, equal dignity, right? For marginalized peoples. The idea that anyone would care about marginalized voices, or they would care about like equal dignity for like, minority groups is a thoroughly Christian idea. It's
Mm-hmm.
only possible with the Christian worldview that affirmatively, that posits affirmatively that all men are created equal, right?
Yeah, yeah. If we could maybe hash that out, so that the listeners can kind of understand why that's not a subjective. You're not saying, hey, I prefer Christianity and I think that's the best thing in the market. You're saying objectively, this is the only thing that leads to that.
Right.
Because just one other example, I've noticed this with, some friends that aren't Christian. But I remember one in particular is a girl, and, she lives in an area where I think finding good guys is much more difficult. Not Midwest values, things like that. And she's found a very good guy. And she always, she's always like, I'm so blessed that I found this great guy. And he's a fantastic guy. And he doesn't go to church, but he grew up in a very Catholic family and went to church every Sunday. So she's got this notion that, he's good, but it's not because he's Christian, because he's not actively Christian. But she's disconnecting the fact that he had a thorough Christian upbringing. And that's one of the things that set him aside. So that's kind of how culture is, right? Where we're saying, we've got these good, healthy ideas. We want to help the poor. We want to do these kind of good humanitarian things. And we're forgetting that we were raised by Christians.
Yes.
Like 2 generations ago, we were raised in Christian households. And a lot of those things carry on, even though we don't call it in the name of Christ.
We've been living off of the capital of Christian civilization and not replenishing it, and the capital is running out. And so it is the last echoes of that Christian civilization that we hear in our public debates today that invoke things like dignity and equality and tolerance and human rights, right? I engage with the author Tom Holland in my book. He wrote a great book in 2019 called Dominion. Tom Holland is a historian. He's not like a Christian historian or anything. He's an academic historian, very good. He's written many books, but his book Dominion was about how like Christian morality like conquered the world, and he does a magisterial job of tracing the roots of human rights and all of these modern notions that we now sort of like take for granted. And he was right about everything in his book, except at the very end, he makes this claim that like there's no reason to think that these moral principles and these values will go away anytime soon, cut off from the actual Christian belief. I think he's wrong about that, and I think that one of the things I try to do in this book is show how once cut off from the source of those claims, we're going to shed the substance of it very quickly, and it's not going to take generations. It's not going to take centuries. It's happening right now, and we can begin to see the broad contours of the kind of society that will come into being in the post-Christian era once we've rejected these claims about the human person, right? Because again, these are normative theological claims about what human beings are, and those kind of ontological claims form the basis of all societies, right? Societies are organized around those claims, right? And so if we are going to embrace a post-Christian, a fundamentally pagan ideology that basically says truth is whatever I say it is, a human being is whatever, each person defines their own truth, and we reject the moral transcendent claims, any moral transcendent claims, and especially the moral transcendent universalist claims of Christianity, then we're going to have a much different kind of society. And it's not going to be the kind of society that embraces things like human rights, because there's no basis for it. In the pagan world, it was considered a moral virtue for me to take what you have and enslave you if I can, if I'm powerful enough, for the sake of my people and my group, right? That was not just considered tolerable. It was considered a virtue, right? Because if I'm strong enough to take what you have and enslave you, it means you're a natural slave, and your role, fate has decided that you should be enslaved to my people, and that is the basis on which these empires were organized across vast expanses of time and geography and culture. You see the same pattern repeating, and the more advanced the pagan society was, the more sophisticated and brutal the slave empire became, the more centralized. Ancient Rome, most people in the ancient Roman Empire were slaves. They were not like Roman citizens. Like it was a slave empire.
That's why it's such a big deal. Paul was a Roman citizen.
Yes, right, exactly. It was a slave empire. It was a slave economy. And I think we lose sight of that. We kind of like, it's back in the mists of time, so it's easy to romanticize the pagan past. But we really need to understand that these theological claims about human beings and about equality or inequality, they have profound consequences for the kinds of societies that emerge, from those worldviews.
Well, maybe to give an example, and you've got some great examples in the book, and I'd like to walk through some of those.
Yeah.
Because I think it paints a good picture. Because just an example so Christianity, we've got a picture of a God who creates, and then he creates man in his image. And we'd say, okay, well, what he's created is good. So there's this goodness that flows from God, and now he's going to bestow it upon man, and man's job is to carry and align himself with this goodness. That's very simple creation theology. And then, of course, when you get to Christ, then you've got one who's willing to give of himself now, pour out of himself, say, my body given for you. And the Christian church is supposed to now embody that. So if you have even just the base belief in Christianity, it would make perfect sense to say, you know what, bubonic plagues breaking out. And what do we need to do as a Christian church? We can't hit the hills. We actually have to go in and care for those who are poor. And that's what the Christian church would do. That's not normal history, but it makes perfect sense if you start with a Christian ethos and belief system. So that's we've inherited in the West. Then if you take that versus, I think you talk about the Vikings in the book, right? And so if you look at their gods, they don't have a creation story like that. Their creation story has to do with two gods fighting, and one god is victorious and then makes the world out of the flesh of this, like, destroyed god, and humanity is kind of like an offspawn of this. And that their gods are going to at some point participate in this grand bloody battle that's going to be the end of the world, and then there's going to be some kind of rebirth.
Right.
And your role is to become as great of a warrior and as brutal as possible, so that when you die, you'll die with honor, and then you'll be able to participate in the afterlife in kind of this frat party / ongoing battle, right? This great, whatever that, I forget the name of
Ragnarok.
Yeah. Right. So that's their belief system, right? That's their ethos. Compare that versus Christianity. That's a very normal, the one I just articulated is a very normal pagan type ethos. What in that process makes someone say, oh, there's a sojourner, there's a traveler from another nation, I should give him hospitality and give him some food and let him on his way? It doesn't. It says, if I can go, if I can go rape that person, or if I can go attack that person, if I can go take the person's stuff, that's showing my strength, and it's making me hardened for battle. And so their whole culture operated on that way, right?
Yeah, right. No, yeah, and where it's based on, coercion and force and will, are the organizing principles, right, around which society is going to be governed, right? So you're absolutely right, and it's a pattern. It's a striking pattern that you see over and over again. It doesn't matter how far back you go in time, or how far forward you carry it into time. And one of the examples I give in the first chapter, just to sort of demonstrate that you can't evolve your way out of this pagan worldview, right? The passage of time alone doesn't make it go away. Modernity doesn't necessarily destroy it either. There was a group of people, a nation in 19th century Africa along the Ivory Coast called the Kingdom of Benin, and it was destroyed by or conquered by the British Empire in the 1890s after a contingent of British representatives and soldiers were massacred. But the Kingdom of Benin engaged in human sacrifice on an absolutely sort of Carthaginian scale relative to their size, right? Human sacrifice and cannibalism were at the center of their sort of religious and communal life, right? And this sort of like came out, once the massacre was discovered. The British Crown sent a contingent of soldiers to go in and do a punitive expedition, and recover the bodies and all that stuff. And in the process of that battle, the people of Benin, the king of Benin, just enacted this like holocaust of human sacrifice in hopes of warding off the approaching British column. Right? It was an appeal to their gods that if they just sacrificed enough people, then they would be spared, and their gods would intervene and save them, right? But this happened at the end of the 19th century. The Kingdom of Benin had been in contact with other colonial powers besides the British. Like it wasn't like a lost tribe or anything. In fact, the reason that the initial British expedition approached the Kingdom of Benin was to establish like a trade relationship. These were a known people, but their encounter with modernity is not what overthrew their paganism. In the end, their paganism was wiped out by force by the British Army, and this pattern is also repeated over and over. That it is and why did the British wipe them out? Because once they saw what it was, once they saw what these people were, what they were engaged in, this level of human sacrifice sacrificing slaves, sacrificing their own people, and ritually murdering like the British captives that they had,
and children, right?
And children too, right? Which is another recurring theme. They had the same reaction, Hernan Cortez did to the Aztecs. Seeing this basically demonic culture, they said, we have to destroy this. And in the process of destroying it, and we see this going back to medieval Europe, in the process of confronting and destroying these pagan orders, conversions take place.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the reason conversions take place is because from the pagans' point of view, they see a God that's more powerful than their God.
Mm-hmm.
They see a source of power and a way of wielding power that is compelling to them,
mm-hmm.
right? Even in the face sometimes of what looks maybe outwardly like powerlessness. And so you have the situation in ancient Rome where centuries of martyrdom converted, in the midst of this martyrdom of Christians over the course of generations, massive conversions to Christianity were taking place,
mm-hmm.
To the point that Christianity conquered the Roman Empire,
mm-hmm.
not through force of arms, but through another source of power that was irresistible in the end. So it's I think it's worth thinking about these things and trying to think through like how pagan systems worked and what they were, so that we can understand the differences between a pagan worldview and it's what it produces, and a Christian worldview and what it produces. As we move into this post-Christian era, we need to be prepared for the fact that these sort of atrocities and this brutality and this coercion that was a hallmark of the pagan world of the past
mm-hmm.
is going to come back. It's not going to come back in the same form. I'm not saying we're going to have temples to Zeus and Apollo cropping up in Times Square.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to take new forms, but it will embody the same ethos as it always did.
Yeah. I think that's a different way of looking at history, not traditionally, right? Not historic, not even 120 years ago,
mm-hmm.
right? But recently, of course, we've had kind of this multiculturalism pop up,
mm-hmm.
This social studies,
mm-hmm.
right? Where you just you look through history and you see, oh, there's this complexity of ways that different societies operate. And you look at this one, and it's,
right.
and you just kind of look at each one and you say, that's interesting, right? And then you move on to the next one and you say, well, that's interesting.
Right.
And it creates this understanding that there's just there's all these different cultural expressions and fluidity and all of this throughout history.
They're all equally valid.
All equally valid. And then, oh, you're from Christianity, or you inherited the West. Okay, well, you're just one of the other ones that have equal amount of strengths and weaknesses, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that's the right way to look at history. It's not the way we looked at history as early as 100 years ago, right? That's very new, that type of mindset. But that's where I think this recovery of understanding paganism helps you see the world, the Old Testament is very obvious in this, right? There's paganism. Mm-hmm. That's what it is. It might look like the Egyptians, might look like the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Philistines, slightly different nuances, but they're all going to have these themes, mostly human sacrifice, a lot of child sacrifice.
And slavery.
Slavery and a type of generational slavery.
Yeah.
Right. And a type of
something very different than the sort of modern race-based chattel slavery that arose in the New World,
mm-hmm.
which was a departure, which is very different than ancient slavery,
mm-hmm.
and I would argue was a departure from the Christian tradition up to that point.
Yeah,
it was very much a creation of the modern era.
Mm-hmm.
It's creation of sort of transcontinental industrial capitalism,
mm-hmm.
and was. Because I only say that to say, because people might say like, well, Christianity had slavery too, but it was not it wasn't pagan slavery, it wasn't multi-generational slavery, and it was not incorporated into society in the way that ancient slavery was actually like part of like the part of the whole structure of how society was ordered and governed. That was not the experience of American Southern American slavery,
mm-hmm.
which was both a departure from ancient pagan slavery, but it was also a departure from like how Christianity had understood slavery for many centuries in Europe.
Well, because even in like Exodus 21, I think it is what it is. That's where you're getting kind of the rule of how to deal with slavery within the Israelite nation. Which, to your point, there has to be some kind of indentured work, right? We call it employment now, but they didn't have,
Mhm.
the system was so different back
Right.
then, right? You didn't have accounting firms with like 75 employees that went back and forth in the suburbs. Like,
Right.
but what did they say? God said, 6 years, right? Someone's going to they can pledge servitude for 6 years.
Right.
And then after that, they can be free, or they can decide to to pledge their life. But the decision then rests on the individual.
Right.
Right. So that's a completely different system,
Right.
to your point. But yeah, so either way, you've got this history of paganism, all of these different examples. You can hash out a couple more that you did in your book, but you've got the Carthaginians, you've got the Aztecs, you've got the Vikings, you've got, the Germanic, tribes
Right.
and their history. And it all looks very similar.
Right.
And it looks like, what we'll continue to tease out here. But then you have one other thing that operates, and that is kind of Judaism in the Old Testament,
Mhm.
and then Christianity in the New Testament, which operates on a completely different framework and ethos.
Mhm.
And I think when you look at history that way, that's the right way to look at it.
Right.
And then you can look at your Christian history and say, okay, where did we make some bad moves or good moves or whatnot? But it really is a light in the darkness, because
Mhm.
the paganism that is all around is completely dark, and it's
Mhm.
built dark on the system. It doesn't only make mistakes
Yeah.
executing its system. It's a bad, dark system.
It's not a departure from the ideal, right? Like 19th century chattel slavery was a departure and a corruption of the Christian ideal.
And we can prove that, right?
Right.
Because we can go back to the scriptures, we can go back to the church fathers and the history of the church and say, here's all of these
Yes.
individuals where the church has said, we don't do things like that, and you did something like that, and therefore,
And
objectively,
it was
we can say
very,
you
very
were
clearly
wrong.
trying to justify, sort of an ex post facto like justification for the slave trade
Yeah.
and for the economic system of the antebellum South. Like they're
Mhm.
just trying to like fit a square peg into a round hole, right? Whereas, to your point, in the pagan world, the atrocities were not departures from the ideal. They were the fulfillments of the
Mhm.
ideal. They were striving toward the ideal, right? The slavery, the sacrifice, the brutality was sort of the point.
Mhm.
It was baked into the worldview, and that's why it repeats itself over and over in all these different contexts. And that's why you can see a pattern when you look at history.
Mhm.
And I think that is the right way to look at history, not approaching it from this like sort of like as a clean slate where you have like no moral judgments, where you're completely neutral. You end up kind of like making a nonsense of history, right?
Mhm.
Not able to tell a story about the past that bears any relation to what was really happening, and how society really has changed and developed over time. Yeah, and the other thing you end up doing is creating villains. Where there aren't none, right?
Mhm.
I'm thinking sort of like the Howard Zinn kind of take on history, that America has been this like force for evil.
Mhm.
And that gets into history not as a pursuit of the truth, or a deeper understanding of the past, but as a weapon for like political fights, like in the here and now.
Yeah.
Right. Which is what we see. Which is what we see in academia. It's what we see in our politics. The weaponization of history.
Mhm. So how are we moving now back towards paganism, right? So that's what pagan is historically. If you want to hash anything else out there, let me know. But if you want to kind of pivot to now, how is that something that we're moving back towards, right?
Yeah. So how is it expressing itself? How are the old gods are back, but they're in new guises, and it's hard for us to recognize them as such, and hard really even to talk about it as pagan. I think we use other words when we're describing these phenomenon. We say woke, or we say that they're radical leftists. But what do we mean by that? What we mean, I think, is that we are embracing a radical moral subjectivity and a radical relativism in across all these different areas of our public life and in our culture, from talk about abortion, from the transgenderism, to even to basic things about like marriage and child rearing and family formation. There's a desire to destroy any sense of objective moral truth
Mm-hmm.
or reality, right? And reality is whatever the individual says they are. So it's easy to think, well, this is an elevation of the individual, of each individual's consciousness or judgment as the arbiter of all things, right? And that maybe seems more like nihilism or self-worship. And one of the things I argue in the book is that what may first appear as nihilism or self-worship ends up looking much more like paganism if you sort of dig into like the different expressions of it. Because as I quote the writer Paul Kingsnorth, he says that there's a throne at the heart of every culture, right? Something's going to sit on it. And so even people who are totally committed to something like transgenderism or transhumanism, in the end, they don't worship themselves. They worship something external to themselves, right? They often do not call these things gods, right? Mm-hmm. There are people. There is a resurgence of paganism that's sort of like openly pagan, like a growing popularity of witchcraft. Mm-hmm. You see this on social media with social media influencers, growing popularity of like astrology and tarot cards and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And so sort of this new age kind of paganism. So we're seeing that growing in popularity, but I argue that like even transgenderism and transhumanism is an expression of this new paganism that uses a totally different vocabulary to describe its enthrallment to what essentially are pagan gods, right?
So is this coming from the starting point that paganism is subjective because it doesn't have an objective morality that comes from God? Is that what you're saying? That this is what leads to that?
Yeah, part of the pagan worldview is that rejecting sort of transcendent moral objective truth and moral claims mm-hmm. that come from a single God, about what creation is. Pagans were free to divinize the here and now, the whether it be physical phenomenon, natural phenomenon, or even people, like the Caesar as a god man, right? Okay. And we sort of like see this muddling through in the pagan world of being able to, in other words, like the divine is kind of fungible, mm-hmm. It's not transcendent. It's immanent, mm-hmm. It's here. And in that context, you could have a God man, or you could have a God that was the God of this phenomenon, mm-hmm. The sea or the sky, and other gods that were gods over this other thing. But there was no transcendent God that was the one God over all, from whom all these other things were made, and on whom all these other things subsist. Mm-hmm. And so you end up with a kind of subjectivity. And what we were talking about earlier is the kind of the subjectivity or the relativity of violence and force, right? That if might makes right, then whoever happens to be strongest is right, mm-hmm. and has a right to rule. And this is even built into the cosmology of paganism, of like the Canaanite or ancient Near East Mesopotamian paganism, that Baal, there was a rebellion in heaven and Baal overthrew his father and took the throne by force, right? The ancient Israelite religion was a corrective to that pagan cosmology. Mm-hmm. The Israelites said there was a rebellion in heaven, but it failed. And Satan was cast down. Satan and the rebellious angels were cast down and defeated by the Most High God. Mm-hmm. And so the reason I say that the radical subjectivity and moral relativism of our time is fundamentally pagan is for that reason, because it's a rejection of transcendent reality, not just transcendent moral truth, but transcendent reality, and in favor of a contingent relative reality, in which if you are strong enough and you have enough will and enough ability to coerce, then you can rule by right over others, and your God is the most powerful God, mm-hmm. Or your pantheon of gods is the most powerful gods, and so So it makes sense, in other words, that in our time, as we shed our Christianity, as we move into this post-Christian era, that we are re-embracing like a contingent cosmology, a relativistic worldview, in which truth isn't something that's fixed and transcendent and objective. Truth is something that shifts and changes, and what is true for at one time in one place may change based on the circumstances, or what is true for one person may not be true for another. And so one expression of that is the kind of the nihilism and so the myopic moral relativity that we see in so many different places in our culture. But another expression of it is under the guise of sort of like living my own truth, we increasingly are seeing people reach forward, and what they're really reaching backward to new forms of paganism. And I talk about that in one case with this transhumanist guy, Brian Johnson, right? Who is the reason I talk about it, because he's a really radical example of this ideology playing itself out. And it may, at first blush, it seems like, well, he's a nihilist. He's worshiping himself. He has this idea that he can live forever, like if he just changes his diet.
That's right.
Yeah. In reality, what he's done is turn his life over to these AI algorithms that he treats as a kind of God, that he believes this God can confer on him immortality.
Yeah.
These very old things are coming back, but they're coming back in new guises, in a new modern context. But part of my goal with the book is to try to explain why it is this is happening and what it's a part of. And it's a part of a very long story.
One thing that interests me, maybe we can kind of move into this, is so understanding this history, I think, as far as pagan and then Christianity kind of conquering this darkness of paganism in the West, and reaching its high point. Now it seems to be on this downward trajectory, right? And then this paganism is coming back from the ashes, because it's really the only other alternative is the thesis. And I agree. And
it never goes away. Like paganism never Christianity conquered it, but it's always there, right? And just to be clear, since we're on a Christian podcast, the reason it's always there is because like the devil and the fallen angels are still there. They were cast down from heaven. They're here now. They're not going to go away until all things are made new, right? The pagan gods, and this was something the ancient Mesopotamians believed, and the ancient Israelites also believed, was that these pagan gods weren't just like constructions.
Yes,
they're real beings. Like they exist, and they have real power, right? So that's the other reason that like paganism doesn't go away, because the objects of pagan worship have not gone away. They're real, and they are still here.
Let's lean into that, because that's something I find most people don't think.
Right.
I don't know if it's I don't think it's just my denomination by any means, but I think for a while we would use the word fake gods. You know, and whatever we meant by that, what was heard was, oh, these were like figments of the imagination, right? Like someone might believe in God, or someone might believe in flying spaghetti monster, right? And those are the two things. So you look at like the story of Elijah, right, and the prophets of Baal and Ashtaroth, and so they go about their systems, right? And Elijah builds his altar, and it's very humble, and they build their altar, and the prophets of Baal and Ashtaroth start going through and they start doing their rituals and their ceremonies, and they start spilling human blood, right, and spilling their own, and you're almost, as a kid, you like read that and you go, oh, like they're trying this for the first time, like that's a really goofy idea for calling upon this fake god. And the answer is no. Normally, when they spill human blood, normally something happens. And that something
it wasn't just
power.
A weird hobby that these groups had, that they had, these very sophisticated militaries and these very highly sophisticated bureaucracies of state, beautiful architecture, complex like agricultural infrastructure. They managed like these sprawling empires, and then they had like a weird hobby that they did, which was their religion, which was totally not connected to anything, and it was just sort of this like cosplay, like that. That's not what it was. They were calling upon real powers, right? They wouldn't do it if there was no payoff, if there was no purchase to it, right? It wasn't. They weren't LARPing, right? The prophets of Baal weren't LARPing, and it wasn't the first time they had done it. You're right, and we have a tendency, because we're so far removed from that world,
Mm-hmm.
and it seems so in such the midst of the distant past that we err by not taking those people seriously and not taking their sort of cosmology seriously, and not understanding, I think, what Elijah and the Old Testament prophets and the apostles and the people of that world understood was that there really is like a battle. There is a war going on
Mm-hmm.
between heaven, between God and his angels, and the fallen angels, the rebellious angels. That the rebellious angels are the pagan gods,
Mm-hmm.
and they
100%.
do have power, and those peoples, and not only that, Scripture tells us that the powers and principalities of darkness were given authority over the world. They're over the fallen, sinful world. They are here, and they are the rulers of this world for now,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the kingdom of God is a light in the darkness of the world, because it posits a new power over and against the powers of this world. But we totally err in thinking that the powers are imaginary. They're not imaginary.
Yeah. And Paul doesn't speak that. I mean,
None
Psalm
of them
106, I mean, for instance, says when you sacrifice, and Paul repeats this in, I think, 1 Corinthians, maybe 2 Corinthians, that when you sacrifice your children, Psalm 106, when you sacrifice your children, you're sacrificing them to demons.
Mm-hmm.
And then Paul picks that up and he says, when you even go worship at these altars, you are connecting yourself to demons,
Right.
is what he says. And
Right.
he uses the word idols and then demons almost interchangeably.
Mm-hmm.
So what are these pagan practices? They are some form of interchanging with demonic beings
Mm-hmm.
who do have power. As you
Mm-hmm.
said, they've been given authority by God to some degree. They've revolted.
Mm-hmm.
That position is still held, but now it's a darkened position.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the world throughout history understood, if you access these things, they will partner with you.
They
You will have to give things to them.
Yes.
Which is why you talked about, human sacrifice and often child sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
And even at the age of 4, isn't that right? Like there's just this weird theme throughout a lot of these different sacrificial systems where you can see the bones, and there's a lot of 4-year-olds, right? So there's this system in place. They hand this over, and then they receive things in return, such as technology and advancement and victory in war and things like that. And so they keep doing these interchanges. And then in comes Christianity and says, cut that out, don't do that. There is a more powerful God here, but the way that you interchange with him is not like that.
Right.
You're going to pray, and you're not going to get an immediate power zapped into you. It's going to be a much slower process, one of trust, one of humility, and one of aligning yourself and your life back to the order which God has subscribed.
Yeah.
And that's how your life will end up being fruitful.
And that's why the pagan world was an inversion, like of the Jewish and Christian worlds, and the pagan practices were inversions of Jewish and Christian practices. The pagans went to their altars to feed their gods, right?
Mm-hmm.
We go to our altars to be fed by our God, right? They elevated a man to the position of a god just at the moment that God took the form of a man, right? And so there's no way to understand this stuff, I think, sort of just as like an agnostic or atheist, observer, who rejects like all spiritual reality, like not like on a metaphysical level, just says like the spirit world doesn't exist. The only thing that exists is the material world. A cold, hard materialist is not going to be able to make sense of history for just the reason that you say. There is no way these people would do that. The Aztec society, the whole thing was organized around the pagan cult of human sacrifice to their two main deities. The like architectural layout of the cities and of their city, and the temple complex, the Templo Mayor. Their battlefield tactics were based on the need to capture enemy combatants alive so they could sacrifice them. It was once Cortez found that out, he used it to his advantage, by the way.
Good for him.
This isn't sort of like just a weird hobby cosplay thing. It was a transaction, right? Exactly as you say. And there's a broad uniformity of belief about how this worked too in the ancient Near Eastern world, that you would get real goods if you transacted with these beings and offered them fealty. And, to circle back to, poor old Brian Johnson, who thinks he's going to live forever. He's in a transactional relationship with what is, in essence, a new pagan god, of these AI algorithms that he thinks if he subordinates his whole life, destroys his family, which he's done, subordinates all of his desires and even his humanity, in how he lives his life day to day. This Time magazine profile back in September kind of chronicled what his life is. Sounds horrible.
Yeah. It's not a human life.
It's not a human life. So he's sacrificing his own humanity to these algorithms in exchange for something. At one point he started ingesting the blood plasma of his 18-year-old son. As any catechized person understands, it's very pagan indeed, right? Thinking that you can get something like that from the blood of your offspring. So he's getting something in return for his fealty to this new god, right? Which in this case is these AI algorithms that he thinks can give him immortality. We're going to start seeing a lot more of that, and it doesn't matter that it's not rational or not scientific, because rationality and a scientific way of thinking and the operation of reason itself are inheritances from Christianity. Cut off from Christianity, they become disfigured and monstrous and inchoate. And that's why we see this sort of we're in this weird moment right now culturally where we invoke science on the one hand, science, we follow the science. And in the same breath, we ignore the science on everything from COVID to abortion, to euthanasia, to a whole host of things, right, that we could get into. That we still feel this fealty to objectivity, but in practice we're departing from it more and more.
Yeah. So how has the Christian church kind of failed in this transition, right? Because I think it's chapter maybe 4 in your book. That one I was very much fascinated with, because you've kind of already at this point articulated the danger of paganism, kind of this return aspect, and then you kind of went through some of the history in chapter 3, if I remember right, of just kind of misconceptions that and you've kind of touched on that. But in chapter 4, you showed just kind of this abortion of theology that takes place within the Christian church over the last 60, 70 years. And just how that has led to this failure, right? And it's an ongoing, we are sinning daily as the Christian church in America. I'm not, I would vouch that the LCMS is working hard to try to have safeguards, same with the Catholic Church, which you're part of, Orthodox Church, maybe PCA as well. But most of the other ones have just hook, line, and sinker bought into a system of doing Christianity, which has bankrupted our ability to have any kind of ability to defend against this onslaught. It's
a rejection of objective morality and an objective moral truth. So it's a war on reality, and which has had dire consequences for Christianity in America, and we focus a lot in our discussions, and in the book I focus a lot on the sexual revolution and the changes that began in the middle of the last century, 60s and 70s especially. But it began, before that, right? The seeds of it go further back. But we start to see, we start to see both the zenith of mainline Protestant Christianity in the 1950s and the early 1960s, and immediately the precipitous fall, right? Like following very closely right after that. And I think there's two important things to tease out about that. One is what you mentioned earlier about John F. Kennedy, sort of typifying this new way of thinking about religion, that religion was going to be this strictly private thing. It wasn't going to influence. And of course, in his case, he very obviously was trying to assuage the fears of a Protestant establishment that was afraid that to have this Catholic president was going to mean dual loyalty to Rome, kind of this old very American tradition of anti-Catholic bigotry. He was trying to get ahead of that and sort of neuter it, and say, so he just came out, and in the process of doing that, which, by the way, was just, he was doing it as an appeal to power, right? He needed these powerful establishment figures in mainline Protestantism to back his candidacy. And so to do that, he was willing to endorse and embark upon a departure of how most Americans and most American leaders had understood the role of Christianity in American life since the beginning, right? Eisenhower didn't talk the way JFK talked. Eisenhower, if anything, Eisenhower converted to Presbyterianism, I think, after he became president.
He was baptized.
He was baptized after he became president, right? That was just like a decade earlier, right? So there was like this, right at kind of the zenith of the main line, within a decade, you had this radical departure typified by Kennedy's speech, in which he disavowed any influence on public life of his own, like, religious beliefs, something that would have been completely foreign to, like, say, John Adams or George Washington. They wouldn't have understood that at all. Kennedy did it, as I said, to attain power, right? And so he was sort of willing to court power, and he was backed, like, by a lot of Catholic bishops for this too. So they it's not just Kennedy's problem, right? It was the institutional church, both the Protestants and the Catholics were complicit in this. Catholic bishops were happy about this because they thought, well, finally, Catholics can attain respectability and attain to positions of high influence and power in American politics, something that they hadn't been able to do in the past. And so there was that. There was this embrace of the idea that religion should be private, right? And it shouldn't be something that was part of the public square. It shouldn't be something that influenced public policy. The principles on which we were going to form public policy would be different principles other than religious or Christian moral principles, right? We're going to have these objective, neutral, secular principles, Christless Christianity, divorced from the actual faith. That was one thing. The other thing was the embrace of subjectivity and relativism, right, in theology, right, which took the form, I think, of a rejection of the idea of sin, right? And so you saw that the most dramatic manifestations of that were changes in doctrine and practice in the main line that we saw beginning in the 1970s and then accelerating very quickly up to the present time. It's still happening. Just last week, the United Methodists announced that they would accept gay clergy and gay weddings, which we were talking the other day. I was surprised they hadn't already done that. But, so when I saw the headline, I was like, I thought the United Methodists had decided to do that a long time ago, but apparently not. They made it official just last week. So this is still happening, and that is a process that has been working itself out since the 1970s of like this embrace of sort of theological relativity where you cannot objectively say anything is wrong or contrary to scripture or Christian teaching because each person has their own truth. And so you can't really say what sin is, and so we have to accept homosexuality. We have to accept abortion. We have to accept transgender identities, right? The only thing we can't accept is judgment from people who insist on, moral objectivity, right? Those, I think, are the two things that have created that contributed most to what we can fairly call a collapse of Christianity.
Yeah. Now that's interesting. And that's something we wrestle with, because you mentioned the ELCA, for instance, in your book, right? And you talk about the vast ways they've jumped into this plurality of thought, this subjectivism,
right.
They've ceased to be a Christian church,
right.
without any doubt. But I think it also comes down to just a misunderstanding of what Christianity is. And we're at fault of this too. I hear this, and you might even hear this in your circles as well. I think it's maybe it's just a common thought when it comes to Christianity. But the idea just becomes, well, let me put it this way. I was at a conference and there was a speaker and he just did an atrocious job. And his whole thing was, he just said, God is good, was his thesis. he never gave any argument for why God is good or any examples of why God is good. He just kind of tried to rile the crowd up. And he kept doing that. He was a kind of a grandiose type speaker and just kept saying, God is good. God is good. Okay, so maybe he is, maybe he isn't. What's your kind of thought system for making a claim like that? Because if your only ability is to kind of rile people up on some kind of saying like that, which is, what does that mean?
And what is good?
Right. Good. There's nothing defined there.
Right.
And when you do that, there's no difference from that than like a cult leader. Like a cult leader can rile people up to some kind of ethos that at the very first sounds good. But if you don't hash that out and have a system for what does that mean? Okay, so if God is good, how do I now interact with my wife? Or what do I train my children in order to do? How should they think about goodness, right? And Christianity has historically done this very well, right? It's a system
and did it for a long time with centuries and centuries of like really heated and deep and meticulous theological debates about, seemingly small things. I mean, it's easy to kind of laugh at scholasticism as like an extended debate on, about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin.
Yeah.
But the reason that they had those debates, the reason it was important to sort of like get the name of God right, or get the attributes of God right, and to get the theology right, is so that you could define, what is God and what is he asking of us? How do we serve him in spirit and in truth? And what this is another strain in European, centuries of European Christianity. What is God not? Right? Sort of the divine language of unsaying. But there's a reason that that Christendom spent so much time on that, so that there could be substance to the faith, and we would know how we should live, and that we would not go astray and fall back into paganism.
Yeah, which is very much an emotive type thing, right? And paganism runs that way too. Like it doesn't have a system of morality built into the pagan religion.
Right.
The state decides the morality, right? The religion doesn't. But Christianity is different, and it says, as we talked about earlier, okay, goodness comes from God, mankind created in God's image, and what does that goodness look like? Okay, well, here we have our thesis on marriage, which comes directly from the Bible. Here's our thesis on what it means to parent children, obey your parent, 10 commandments, don't covet. What does that mean? And you hash all of these things out.
How are these things reflections of a divine reality?
Yeah.
Right.
And then how does it manifest in the life? So if you have let's say you have a congregation of 300 people in a town of 500 people, right? Fictitious example. Those 300 people should be aligned in understanding how do they approach parenting, right? What kind of things should their kids do or not do? And I don't mean like, are they allowed to watch a football game or not? But these kind of moral lines in the sand that the Bible speaks to. And if the Bible doesn't speak to it, that's adiaphora, and that's fine. And then you'll get to, okay, well, how do I speak about God? Well, he was both God, our Jesus. He was both God and man. I understand God as this Trinity. And you have this, what happens is this whole system comes into place so that everyone in the church is now being trained to think like God has designed them to think in a multifaceted way. And then in accomplishing that, which it won't ever be perfect, but it's always a trajectory, then they go out into their community and they bring these things into their life. So their households operate in a way. They come together and their schools operate in a certain way. The way that the kids will play together at a playground operates in a certain way. And the other 200 that aren't part of the church are now impacted by that in such a way, and they're able to be exposed to that light, right? Just by seeing the beauty of the way that the ordered life.
And they also benefit from that order.
Yeah.
Tremendously. And that was the story in America.
Yeah.
For much of our history. We were able to tolerate and absorb like non-Christian peoples.
Yeah.
For that reason, but it doesn't work when the majority is rejects that way of thinking and that way of life,
or even
and seeks to crush it, which is the world we're entering now.
And then the problem that the church has played in that is you've got in our community, for instance, we're going to have like an ELCA church, and those people are walking around as Christians, right? That might have a cross on their car or something like that, or a necklace on. But they don't operate as Christians. They don't live according to that system. And the problem theologically is those church bodies had basically said, do you love Jesus? Or do you say God is good? And they would all say yes. And they'd say, okay, well, you have faith and you're living out your faith. And then they will also say, we have examples of this, of people that have left these churches and come, they'll say, oh, wife wants to divorce husband and get married to a woman, children in the mix. that's okay. The church blesses that,
Mhm.
right? So it creates this paganism called Christianity, but it's really
Mhm.
paganism.
Yeah.
And it creates then this entire confusion
Yeah.
within the whole Christian network, and then it makes the church become almost obsolete and lose its voice. So it's,
Yeah, because of
that's
a series of really bad category errors and vocabulary confusion, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's why it's important to kind of tease out, like, what do we mean by Christian? What do we mean
Mhm.
by pagan, right? And what are the differences in the way these things operate and what they produce
Mhm.
because of the fundamental sort of ontological claims, like that lie at the heart of them. And the big problem that we have now that you're describing is that much of the Christian church in America is Christian in name only,
Mhm.
and in practice, what they are operating on a pagan moral framework,
Mhm.
not on a Christian one, even though they still have all the trappings, and the buildings, investments, and symbols, oftentimes, of Christianity. They're not Christian in a meaningful sense,
Mhm.
and indeed, in some cases, it would be more accurate to call them pagan.
Yeah. And I think just calling them that might be quite helpful. Not like, oh, well, there's that version of Christianity over there, but yeah, those are pagans.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
How do you know they're pagans? Well, they're speaking morally like a pagan speaks, and not like the Bible speaks.
Right.
And that's a pretty obvious that they're pagan. Yeah. Well, thanks for helping me hash that out.
This isn't the first
very
time.
much helping me kind of think through this failure.
And this isn't the first time that the church has encountered this. Like, the conversion of Europe was a process that took centuries, and there were moments, there were times when the church would go into an area, convert pagans, but not able to sustain the mission or the attention and the catechism necessary for Christianity to take,
Mhm.
and to really displace pagan practices. And so you would have missionaries go out, and then years and years would go by, decades sometimes, and Christian missionaries would come back to these areas and see that Christianity had been corrupted in those places, and there was like this syncretism between pagan practices and Christian practices, and profound error had been introduced, and you would basically have to reconvert and recatechize these sort of like quasi-Christian, mostly pagan peoples,
Mhm.
especially in Northern Europe. This would happen over and over again. It was one of the reasons it took so long to convert, like the Saxons, because there was this sustained missionary effort was required to get Christianity to stick,
Mhm.
because the pull of paganism was so strong, and absent that, like, attention to discipleship and to catechism, Christianity would get corrupted.
Mhm.
And this is a pattern that we see, not just, it happened in Europe, happened all over the world,
Mhm.
in different ways, that without that sustained effort to really establish Christianity in the hearts and minds and the practices of the people, so that their social practices and like the way they kind of organized their societies was conformed to Christian teaching. Until you got to that point, there was always the risk that they would backslide into paganism,
Mhm.
which is the Israelites kept backsliding into paganism over and over. Again, to go back to what we were saying earlier, why? Well, not just because it was like a funny thing that they did. There was a reason. It has its own logic.
Mhm.
It is compelling on its own terms, and it has real things to offer people. And so there was a diligence required in converting these pagan peoples, and I bring that up to say, we're talking about like the collapse of Christianity and the corruption of Christianity in America that we see today. Like, we are going to have to embark on a reconversion of a once Christian people in this country, and that is a project that will require sustained efforts,
Mhm.
because so much of our Christian heritage we've already lost, and has been corrupted in the minds of the people who think that maybe they know what Christianity is, but they don't,
Mhm.
because what what was once Christian has become a new form of paganism.
Do you see any signs that make you optimistic that might take place?
Yes. I would use the word hope rather than optimism.
Yeah.
Right. But I do see a shrinking of the Christian church in America. But as it shrinks, it becomes more faithful and becomes more powerful. Because, of course, what we've seen in the main line with the collapse of the mainline Protestant denominations is that.
And by the way, as a quick caveat for those listening, I would not, and many within the Lutheran Church would not, for the LCMS, would not categorize ourselves as Protestant. That may be the first time you've heard that.
Sure. No, I'm using it as a shorthand, right?
Yeah, which we would agree. Those are the Methodists, the ELCA, most of these other denominations that have gone quite wacko would be kind of fallen into this Protestant.
Right.
So just for the terminology's sake for those listening. But
and I'm using shorthand and speaking colloquially, not technically about this. When I refer to the main line, I'm referring to the mainline Presbyterian Church, PCUSA, United Methodists, ELCA, the Episcopal Church USA, and there's
a few Northern Baptists.
Yeah, there's a few others, right? That broadly speaking make up the main line, and the collapse of the main line is in some ways like the greatest story of like social transformation in American history, because the implications of the collapse of the main line is a collapse of the Christian ethos in America, which I argue has huge implications for our entire way of life, and it will usher in a completely new country, right? A new system of government, a new way of life, a new way of understanding social relations, a new understanding of our rights. That is to say, the disappearance of our rights, and it's important to understand. You ask about hope, that when you embark on this sort of moral relativism that the main line has embarked upon, you embrace this pagan ethos, Christian teaching and practice collapses. But what happens is that those churches disappear. Like they are shrinking, and like some of them, even in our lifetimes, will cease to exist. The Episcopal Church USA is not going to be around in 50 years, right? Like it won't exist. And so you have the total number of Christians shrinking, but you do see growth in certain strains of the Christian church in America, and those, whatever their theological differences, what they have in common is small o orthodoxy. Like they're theologically orthodox. They are morally serious. They tend to be politically conservative. That is to say, they oppose abortion and oppose gay marriage, and those churches are growing, and they're growing very fast. And as that church grows, as those expressions, as those denominations grow, they will become very potent in a post-Christian America, and they will be. That is the source of hope for renewal and for what amounts to a refounding of the country. I talk about this later in the book, and we can take a break and talk about that in another segment if you want. But the reality is, we're not going to be saved by a political party or a candidate, a Republican president or a new Congress or a Supreme Court majority isn't going to reverse this process. This is like a epochal civilizational process that is going to play itself out. The reason for hope from a Christian's perspective is that the Christian faith is very strong and very alive in these communities and is growing. If you go into these theologically orthodox, faithful communities, whether it's in the Lutheran Church or the Catholic Church or the evangelical churches, they're full of children, they're full of young families. They are they are places where the future is bright, in contrast to these mainline churches, which are dying out, literally.
Can you give the example of what's going on in Steubenville? Because I think that's just, from the Catholic side, that's a beautiful expression of what you're talking about.
Yeah, I was in Steubenville in March to record some podcasts there, and Steubenville is this small Rust Belt town in southeastern Ohio that has a Catholic university. The Franciscan University of Steubenville is there. But there's something happening there that I wasn't aware of before I went there to do some interviews about this book. And it is becoming a kind of Catholic colony. And it's not just because of the university. Over the past 3 to 5 years, something like 100 or 115 families, Catholic families, have moved to Steubenville from all over the country and the world. They're coming for thick, true Catholic community. They have no connection to the university in many cases. They are transforming the town. The town has, it's strange when you go there. Like, I immediately noticed that there's something different about this place. And I'll give you one little example, right? I was staying in a hotel across the highway from the university, but the day that I left, I wanted to go to Mass. It was just a weekday Mass, 8 a.m. Mass at St. Peter's downtown. And I didn't have a car. And so I texted the person who was going to take me to the airport. And I said, I'm going to go to Mass at St. Peter's at 8 a.m. Can I just meet you there? Can you just pick me up there afterwards? And he said, I'm going to that same Mass too. I'll just meet you there. I said, okay, great. I looked at my phone. It's about a 20-minute walk. I was like, perfect, beautiful morning, mid-March, sunny weather. I was like, I'll just walk. And I wasn't really sure about the way the roads and highways are set up in some places, walking is not always like an option. I was like, I'll just figure out a way to walk there. So I go out the parking lot of the hotel and I was like, okay, I need to go this way. So I walk to the end of the parking lot and there's like a kind of like a scrubby field, and like some like broken down fencing, and across at the end of the scrubby field, there's like some concrete highway barriers, and in between them is a little path, and you go through the path, and then you come to like a dead end of a road, and then that kind of begins this like dilapidated neighborhood of a lot of abandoned houses, and that will lead you to like some of the the streets of the town, and then onto the downtown where the Catholic Church was. I was like, well, this is the direction I need to go. It kind of seems sketchy, but it's
8 a.m. on a Sunday.
It's 8 a.m. on a Tuesday. How dangerous could it be? And it's very typical kind of Rust Belt, like somewhat abandoned houses in this neighborhood. As I got closer, as I crossed this like scrubby kind of field of like broken concrete and weeds, I noticed these 2 highway barriers that were like, marking out this like trail, this sort of entrance into the town. There was graffiti on them, bright yellow spray painted graffiti. What the graffiti was the Cairo cross and an arrow pointing.
Yeah. And
I realized this is so people staying in the hotel know how to walk to St. Peter's.
Yeah.
That's what the graffiti is for. Like it was graffiti, right? Spray painted, but in the context, it just struck me as like, these are like signs that this town is going through a transformation. And then I went to Mass, 8 a.m. weekday Mass, full of a multi-generational congregation of people, college students, nuns, old people, families with children. They were all there for a weekday 8 a.m. Mass to like start their days. And I just realized that there was, I started talking to people and asking people about like, what's happening here. And then I found out like all these families are moving here from all over the country to be part of something. There's something happening in Steubenville. Those are the kind of communities that will be the source of rebirth of Christianity in America and a renewal of American Christianity in the midst of what really is like the resurgence of paganism and the emergence of a post-Christian America.
Let's take a break.
Okay.
All right. And we're back. And we've got Greg Joseph with us.
Hi.
Greg, just walking by.
I was just in the parking lot.
Yeah.
So this worked out well.
I think you were going to fish, and we just said, "Hey, why don't you pop on in here?"
That's right. You busy? Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Which is helpful because we talked a little bit about this before, but just some of the movements in history that have led us to where we're at now. A lot of those took place as kind of legal battles, right? And you mentioned a lot of those in your book. And then we're going to get to a couple more diabolical things. These are kind of data points, John, that you give for just kind of signs of what the paganization of America looks like. And two of your chapters, I think, were very potent. One was you were talking about just the attack on the family, right? And some different ways that happens with kind of the undermining of marriage, but even things that are coming in the future. And they almost are inevitably coming is kind of your argument based on the legal standing we've taken on things in our past.
Yep.
And then the other one, which is quite diabolical, is just the transgender, but also tying that into some of these pedophilia things, which are actually gaining steam, which is just, I mean, it's horrendous.
Yes.
But it's horrendous because we're Christian. It's not horrendous because historically.
Yeah, it's not the kind of thing. It's not the kind of thing that, you know, anybody wants to think about and talk about, but it's happening. And so we have to think about it. We have to talk about it. And we have to think of how to stop it. Because it's coming. It's not just coming. It's here. It's here now. And so we have to deal with it.
Yeah. So real quick, right before we jump into that, right before our break, you were telling the story about Steubenville, right? And I think it's just, can you just say maybe the importance of something that Christians might have to consider doing is moving? Is that right?
Yes, right. So I was talking about how, more than 100 families have moved to Steubenville in recent years, Catholic families that are going there for the vibrant Catholic community and fellowship and culture that is coming into being there, right? And this is something that I have heard from other people, mostly Catholics, of people moving to places for the faith community, not for a job, not for an educational opportunity, but for the faith community, because they want to be part of something real and thick community, and they want to raise their kids in those places. And so, yeah, that might mean moving to a different part of the country. It might mean quitting your job, or it might mean your spouse quitting her job, or any number of like major life changes that we are like not accustomed to thinking is like the way that you have success as an American in the modern world. We move for jobs, or we move for like school, but will we move for our faith? Will we move for the sake of being able to raise our children in a faith community that's strong and thick? I think that's the kind of shift in thinking that we need to start, that more Americans who see the problems and want to do something about it have to start entertaining maybe radical ways of changing their lives and changing the rhythm of their lives and maybe the whole like trajectory of their families by like moving to a new area and starting something new. I think that's like going to become like one of the least radical ways of changing your life as we get further into this post-Christian era. But it's certainly something people should start thinking about now, along with a host of other things that we can talk about.
Yeah, it's a good test on the first commandment, because I've run into a lot of situations before where someone will go, oh, just so you know, like we're joining whatever, like an evangelical church, right? And they've been maybe LCMS members their whole life. And well, okay, well, why? Oh, well, we took a job and we moved to this place and there's just no LCMS church. So, right. So that's a good test example of what was more important was a 15% raise versus your actual spiritual life.
Yeah.
And that's something that's wired in, as they feel comfortable saying that to their pastor. It's not like, I know this is kind of off, but I have to confess to you that we did this. It's like, you would do the same thing, right, pastor?
It's the rich young ruler, What must I do to be saved? Sell all you have and come and follow me. And the rich young ruler went away sad, for he was very wealthy. I mean, that is a diabolical temptation of our society that has ensnared many, many Christians. And we've got to start talking about that too, and saying, for the good of your faith, for the good of your soul and the faith of your children, you may have to accept being, having a lower income, right? Or not advancing in your career the way you want to, but there are more important things than a 15% raise, right? And we are going to have to, as we talked earlier about the church shrinking, but becoming more potent. And part of becoming more potent is saying the most important thing in my life and in the life of my family is our faith. Everything is subservient to that. Everything comes after that. Career, work, sports, school, everything is undertaken in light of our faith, our individual faith, how we practice our faith as a family, and how we practice our faith in community. And that has got to become the most important thing. The consequences for which all other, sort of like the prism through which you view all of your other decisions. And that will make the church more potent and more powerful when people start thinking in those terms and get out of this very, very materialist, very capitalist and consumerist mindset that where all our decisions are about, like, how do we get ahead in our careers? I think in some cases we have to walk away from our careers.
Well, you can see even just the practicality of that, right? So with kind of the landscape of things that you've painted, and we'll kind of hash some of this out as we go too. But so you take a 15% pay increase when you move to this area, and there's not a good church community, and it's not going to be the best place to raise your children, right? So what does that look like long term? Well, it looks like most families today, right? Had 3 kids. One kid kind of goes to church every once in a while. One's completely apostatized, and And the parents are very frustrated about it. And they might have a nice house, and maybe they've got, a little bit of a nicer car.
Frustrated and confused.
Yeah.
How did this happen?
And the answer is because you set your household up in this way, right?
Yeah.
Versus you might do kind of what you're talking about. And maybe you move to Steubenville, or you move to Waconia, or you move wherever it is, and you say, we're going to go there because that is a great church community. That's their starting place. I'm pretty sure I can find a job there, And it might have I might make less money. And all of a sudden, what do? Now you've got a healthy, thriving family, and your children are being polished and growing up in a great area where they've got good friends, they've got other parental role models. And flash forward 20, 30 years down the road, and what do you have? Maybe you've got a smaller house, maybe you don't drive as nice of a car, and maybe you're just at peace, right? Maybe your children are not actively rebelling against you and the church and everything that you claimed to believe and hold dear.
And maybe you've taken over your town.
Yeah.
Maybe you've got control of the city council. Maybe you've got pornography out of the libraries. Maybe you have, Saints' Day processions in the streets of your town. Maybe you have Christmas parades. Maybe you've taken over your county. Maybe you've taken over your state. This is sort of like the Reconquista of America, right? That we're talking about. This is about finding and fighting on ground you can win. Don't fight for Minneapolis or Los Angeles or San Francisco. Those places are lost. Get away from them and move to places where you can take the faith back into the public square and gain ground. Establish a beachhead. A beachhead isn't a place where you stay. It's a staging ground for advancing inland. And that's how we have to start thinking the way Christians used to think about our lives and our mission, and like how we are going to transform our society. That's the kind of mentality we need to go into it with.
I was watching, we were talking about this a little bit yesterday, and I don't know the full story here, but I know Russell Brand just got baptized, right? And that's kind of what we know, right? He was baptized. I don't know what church body he was baptized into. I know it's big news because he's got a big following. He's someone that has gone completely 180 from where he was a decade ago, right? But I heard maybe about 5 minutes of him speaking on this. And he was very fired up, right? Which new converts are. There's a potency to a new convert speaking. And as he's speaking, he's comparing the early church and the book of Acts. And he's talking about just these people were getting arrested. These people were speaking boldly. These people were making changes. These people, their whole life was oriented around the importance of this gospel message. Yeah. And you can see that's what's moved him in this direction. Is he's seeing the chaos that's happening. I don't know if he's got his finger on it to the degree of, how you articulated in this book, but he knows this is chaos. And so he started kind of retreating from his liberal kind of wokeism. And then he kind of found just a traditionalism. And then he found a Christianity. And he realized this is where the heart of that health is. And now he's one of those people saying, now we've got to go out and do something about this, right? And therefore having these plans and saying your life really does actually need to be oriented around this gospel message. And it doesn't just mean that you just volunteer at the food shelf once a month, and now you're the hands of Christ. It means that your entire life needs to start with, how do I do this thing as a Christian? How do I do that thing as a Christian? And you answer those questions for all of the facets of your life, and then you do the best Christian thing for that. And if that means moving, if that means joining city council, if that means whatever it means, you have to start actively doing that.
Yeah, there's a I don't know where it is, but C.S. Lewis has a passage about what the Christian life requires and how easy it is to kind of fall into a way of thinking about the Christian life where, you know, you're like the man who's paid his taxes, he's done his bit, and now he just wants to be left alone to enjoy the rest of his income. And that's not how Christianity works. It's not that you just pay your bit and then God will leave you alone, because in the end, God's going to ask everything.
Mm-hmm.
You take up your cross, you know? So we have to change our whole way of thinking and adopt kind of a more radical mindset of the kind that we see with new converts like Russell Brand, and other high profile converts recently, and realize that our faith asks everything of us.
Mm-hmm.
And it may, and it has in times past, and it may again, ask literally everything, like our lives. So we have to start preparing for that, and we have to prepare our kids for that, especially because they're not going to grow up in a culture where that's friendly to Christianity, where there's any kind of prestige or social acceptability attached to Christianity, like there was for our parents and grandparents. It's like we're on the hinge point. It's actually the opposite. They are going to grow up in a world where there are costs to pay to being a Christian, where you're not going to get hired because you're a Christian. You're not going to get into this or that school or grad program if it's known that you're a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to get promoted within your organization if you're known to be a Christian. That's already the case, like right now, and that is only going to increase as we move forward into this era. So that's the world our kids and our grandkids are going to grow up in, and so we need to start inculcating a more radical way of approaching our faith than you know, maybe in the past you could get away with kind of just being like a, you know, Sunday church attending Christian, and you kind of subsisted off of the Christian aura that the rest of society was kind of like, you know, bathed in, but like that's gone now, right? You know, so we can't rely on that anymore. I said earlier, we've spent the capital, you know, it's gone. And so we have to have this completely new approach, a radical approach that Christians in ages past had.
Mm-hmm. Greg, I know we were talking about this a little bit last night too, but you've kind of noticed the same thing, right? And I know you've kind of noticed different stages of your life, but you've kind of reached this point now where you're realizing that this is the calling, right? And it's affecting the way that you understand your even job as a lawyer, right? And the kind of ways that you want to use the skills.
Right.
I don't know if you want to speak to that at all.
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess what I would say about that is, and one of the things I took reading your book was, you know, that the courts for such a long time have been, and we'll get into a little more detail about this anyway, but for such a long time, there's been this wall, this idea that they're trying to separate religion from law. And I think one of the things I took from reading your book was that it's really not possible to do that,
right?
Because the people who created these laws, the framers and the founding fathers were Christians, and the idea of separating religion means you have to define what's not religion first, and you really can't define what religion isn't without defining what religion is. And so I think this case that you mentioned in your book, this Cantwell versus Connecticut, you know, it's really interesting to think about, you know, why we're trying to separate and how this misunderstanding came to be, what this wall concept meant that Jefferson talked about, and, you know, where that's taken us today. So I think, how do you see, is it possible to separate Christianity from law and from, I guess, from sort of the Constitution and the framers' original vision for what Western values actually are?
Yeah, I don't think it is, and I think we see the attempt to separate law from any kind of like moral claims. It produces kind of absurdities, you know, and inconsistencies. The case that you're talking about that I discuss in the book was a case about there was a state regulation that in order to solicit funds for charitable causes or for religious or charitable causes, you needed to get like a permit from some state office to go to like door to door. And the Seventh-day Adventists didn't want to do that. They thought that it was their constitutional right to solicit funds in going door to door for their church, and that they thought the requirement to get a permit to do that was a violation of the Establishment Clause, that this was essentially Connecticut establishing religion by requiring the state to distinguish between a religious or non-religious cause. And the Supreme Court decided the case by saying this essentially that the state is incapable of distinguishing between a religious and a non-religious cause, and has to be and cannot involve itself in this at all. They cannot have a requirement that you obtain a permit to solicit funds for your religious cause, because the state has no competency to do that, because the state has to be strictly neutral and like agnostic about these questions, which is a total departure from how the founders understood the role of the state and how subsequent generations of Americans up to this point, I think this was in 1939 or 1940, understood the role of the state in like promoting morality and supporting morality. Keep in mind, we talked about this earlier, like the first Congress, right? Mm-hmm. The founding generation. The Northwest Ordinance, which was passed in 1787, 2 years before the Constitution was ratified and finalized, had provisions in it for not only the abolishment of slavery in the Northwest Territories, which itself is sort of like a moral claim, right?
That's a statistic most people should know.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Slavery was forbidden in perpetuity in the Northwest Territories. And provision for the funding of churches and schools was also provided in the Northwest Ordinance. So if that wasn't an establishment of religion, how could it possibly be that Connecticut having like a ordinance that requires you to get a permit to go door to door to solicit funds for your religious cause was an establishment of religion? Clearly, there's a break here, right? There's a hard break in our understanding of what the state, whether it's the federal or state or local government, what role they can play in supporting like public morality and the practice of religion in the community. And I think the previous generations of Americans understood that the state did have a role to play in ensuring that the citizens were moral and religious people, right? John Adams' famous line, "Our Constitution was created for a moral and religious people. It's unfit for that of any other." He said that an irreligious and immoral people would blow through our Constitution like a whale through a net. I'm paraphrasing him, but and that's what we've seen. And so like I think it's important to tease out like these, these court rulings are useful because they are like specific points in time where like the philosophical break was written down, but it's sort of a culmination of a shift in thinking that had been underway for a while. But then you have this case, and the justices sort of have that, and a case that happened right after that. I think the Everson case, which was a related religious, First Amendment religious liberty case, where they just kind of spell out like what they mean by separation of church and state, and adopt sort of like it's like a new constitution.
Right. I agree. And that's where I was going next, was the Everson case. Exactly. Right. You cited that long sort of block quote about the court defining, this: neither a state nor the federal government can set up a church, neither can pass laws, neither can force nor influence a person. It's this big quote, and it has all these kind of squishy terms in it that aren't defined. And it's like,
yeah, the state or federal government can't do anything to like support a religion. Like, well, what does that mean?
Right.
Does that mean we can't have blue laws?
Right.
Like, does that mean we can't have, parochial schools?
Right.
but they just made this grand statement as though they were like, I mean, it was kind of like they were refounding the country's relationship to religion, you know?
Right.
Like,
it seemed like they were trying to solve all these problems like before they happened. Like saying, well, we know there are going to be issues here, so we're just going to say all this stuff at once.
and we said this earlier that these kinds of cases like came up before the 1930s and 1940s. These questions about establishment of religion, these First Amendment cases, and they were all decided on like a case by case basis, taking into account these particulars of the case and the parties involved, and the court avoided making these like sweeping claims. I think knowing that it would represent a break with like how we understood our constitutional jurisprudence when it came to religion.
Right. One of the things too, I think that ties into that is, you hear people complain all the time about how they don't get anything done in Washington, and if you read our founding documents, like, well, yeah, that's the point. We have separation of powers. We have checks and balances to make sure that things don't happen quickly.
Right.
And so one of the ways, in my opinion, the court could have protected the Establishment Clause was by doing the opposite of what it did in Everson and saying, hey, let's not do all this stuff at once. Let's go slowly and let's litigate these things question by question as they come up. But by doing this, they really put the cart ahead of the horse and created a whole bunch of questions to litigate that weren't necessarily there to begin with.
And they created a culture like in America and a way of thinking about religion that was new to the American people, but that quickly took hold. And it was a way of thinking about, we talked about Kennedy earlier, JFK, and his speech in the early 1960s. It created a way of thinking about religion where it was like, religion is going to be compartmentalized. It's going to be totally private. It's not, our religious life as a nation isn't going to touch our life, our public life, right? And public policy. And we're going to sequester religion over here, which is a recipe for killing it, right? In practice. And we've seen that happen. When you say that, that no public laws and no public policies can support in any way or promote in any way a religion or a church or religious morality, and furthermore, to the extent that you're going to sort of practice your religion, you have to do it. You have to have this strict separation of like how you practice. I mean, we just had a Supreme Court case. What was it, last year? Football coach who would pray at the 50-yard line after every game. Like, I had to go to the Supreme Court to vindicate his right of religious freedom. In this case, free expression, right? That's the kind of thing that the only reason it got to the Supreme Court is because we went down this road, right? This isn't the kind of thing that ever would have been questioned at all. And there was a whole bunch of court cases that, sort of like, as you mentioned, they created a problem where they had to litigate all these other cases of like reading the Bible in school. You can't read the Bible in school. Praying in school. You can't pray in school now. And like, our schools have to become totally cut off from the Christian religion, which would have been inconceivable to every generation of Americans up until like it happened in the middle of the last century.
So what are some of the, like, okay, well, maybe we can just move over to this. So, one of the implications of this is the way, well, let me put it this way, I guess. Have you ever heard of like Arthur Leff? He wrote I think he was a law professor at Duke, if I remember right. But he wrote this article called "The Grand Says Who," and it's really fascinating. So Arthur Leff was an individual who was, like I said, legal professor, not a Christian, right? So he kind of fell into this, this big secular movement. But he's looking at the legal system and he's saying, we built this off of an assumption of some kind of objective morality that comes from a divine being. So that's what we have built in, but we don't believe that anymore as a nation. So then he goes through and he tries to figure out ways of upholding some kind of moral structure. And he says he can't find a way. So at the very end, he basically says, really the only rule of law is Cain and Abel. That's the only one that we can have based off of our belief system, the strong preying on the weak, right? But then he says, but nevertheless, one of these. Nevertheless, napalming babies is bad. All those that supported Pol Pot, Hitler, Stalin should be put to death. And then he says, but altogether now says who? And then he says, God help us.
Yeah.
Right. So he ends with recognizing that these people are definitely wrong, but I have no way to say that they're wrong. And so it just ends with this. I've got no justification for having any kind of moral objectivity that rules our laws, right? And I think that's where maybe you can just speak to that.
Yeah.
That gets to some of these issues.
That's what Nietzsche's famous line that God is dead, is often taken out of context. People read it as though like Nietzsche was being triumphalist about it. But the full context of his quote, which I don't have memorized off the top of my head, but he's basically saying we're screwed, right? God help us. He's saying God is dead and we've killed him, and now we have no, like we've stepped out into the void, right? And we have no way of determining right from wrong, right? And he saw it as a huge problem, right? And he tried to find a way to solve it, and I think came up with very unsatisfactory answers. But it's the same problem. Like when you have a system of objective morality that's based upon theological claims that come from a divine source, and you just say we're just gonna cut that off. You can only kind of subsist on those theological claims. You can only subsist on the downstream effects of it, the morality, for so long, cut off from the source, because eventually you get to the point where there's no basis for it. Why shouldn't we have the law of Cain and Abel? Like, why shouldn't the strong do what they want? In other words, and we talked about this earlier, but one good way of putting it is that in the pagan world, and increasingly in the post-Christian new pagan world, power was deployed by the powerful on behalf of the powerful against the weak. And the Christian moral revolution was not to say that there's no longer going to be powerful and weak. There's always going to be the powerful and the weak. But the Christian revolution was to say power is now going to be deployed by the powerful on behalf of the weak, not on behalf of the powerful. And so there was a complete shift in the power dynamics at play in a society. And as a result of this moral revolution that rested on theological, ontological claims about the human person. And so if we reject those theological claims, we're going to revert to this pagan power structure where power is going to be deployed by the powerful on their own behalf. And we see that all over now. I mean, the book is not political, and I don't get into politics in the book, but I think we see that, in really striking ways with a kind of a global nationless elite that absolutely deploys power on their own behalf for their own purposes, regardless of its effect on everybody else.
Yeah.
And so, we should expect that, is what I'm saying.
Let's tease out two of those examples. So
Okay.
I think the two that are really interesting. And by the way, we're going to have next week. We're going to be, John, you and I are going to be sitting down again, right? And we're going to release that next week. So there's some other aspects that we've just kind of haven't touched yet that we're going to get into. But the two that I really want to hit for the remainder of this one would be, there's two chapters. One, you talk about kind of transgenderism and how that's even tying into that pedophilia. Maybe we can do that one second. And then the other one was, what was the one that we mentioned earlier? It was
Marriage and the family.
Marriage in the family, and kind of this polygamy and this, what was the other word?
Polyamory. Yeah.
And the dangers there, but we've already set ourselves up for this complete abolition.
Yeah, like I said, we're through the looking glass now,
Yeah.
right? And so something as basic as the institution of marriage, right? Talking about like radical moral subjectivity, basically saying, marriage isn't like an institution that is given by God, right? That between one man and one woman, marriage is something that's open for definition, and redefinition kind of infinitely. And the same like philosophical justifications for gay marriage and for that were deployed during the gay marriage debate, essentially that love is love, and each person is going to define that differently. By the way, these are the same philosophical claims that we saw in Casey versus Planned Parenthood in the abortion decision in 1992, where it was Justice Kennedy, his infamous line that that the meaning of liberty is defining your own reality. Again, I'm paraphrasing, but basically just sort of like a relativistic creed that defined the mystery of human existence, right?
He even said that, right? It's freedom means defining your own existence.
Yes,
right? Yeah,
right. And
or
so
reality even did it.
Right, and so once you're there, then you are in a situation where then it's going to be the people with power that decide what is real for them, and so it's easy to see how this developed in the abortion debate, right? Abortion, when Roe v. Wade passed, the justification, and you see the changing justifications for abortion. And this also demonstrates what we were talking about earlier about the disfigurement of reason and even scientific knowledge. Roe v. Wade passes, the justification is this is not a human being. This is just a clump of cells. Getting an abortion is no different than getting an appendectomy. We don't have to have this big debate about it. Advances in medical technology quickly rendered that justification meaningless, totally untenable. It was clear within a decade of Roe v. Wade being decided that this is a unique human individual. It's not a clump of cells. It is the taking of a life. And so the justification had to switch. And you heard proponents of abortion talk less about clump of cells and more a shift in rhetoric talking about safe, legal, and rare, right? You heard the Clintons talk about this in the 90s, that abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. And there was kind of a tacit acknowledgement that this is an unfortunate thing. We should have compassion for women who are in this situation, and it should be rare. We don't want more abortion, right? And we're not going to get into why, but suffice to say, it should be safe, legal, and rare. And now that's given way completely over the last decade to a new justification for abortion, which is that this is the Shout Your Abortion movement. This is where abortion is justified on the basis that it's a positive good. In fact, that it's necessary to vindicate the constitutional rights of women. And so far from being ashamed of abortion, so far from thinking that it should be safe, legal, and rare, we should celebrate abortion as a great liberating force for all women in America, without which their constitutional rights cannot be vindicated, right? And so that is a totally different moral framework and a very quick transformation of the justifications for abortion that has created a situation now where the only thing that establishes the humanity of an unborn child in America is whether or not the mother wants the child. So you can have two children of the same gestational age in one state, the premature birth of that child, all the medical technology and expertise has to be brought to bear to save the child's life by law. A child of the same age born in another state can be killed with impunity. And the only difference is, does the mother want that child? So it's not even a question of whether or not this is a person. This is a question about power dynamics. And the person with the power in this case is the mother, deploying power on her own behalf, either to save the life of this child or to take it. Now,
so to use Kennedy's language, she has the freedom to create whether or not to speak and say whether or not that's a child.
Essentially, yes. Right.
Yeah.
And so, but of course, even when you say that, it's nonsense to suppose that she is creating that her desire for this child makes it a child or doesn't make it a child. And yet we still talk that way, but it's absolutely an assault on reason because we know it is a child. And so what are we really talking about? What we're saying is we are advancing a pagan moral claim, which is that the person with the power in this situation has the right, by virtue of that power, to say whether or not this killing is licit or illicit. And the power rests with them because they are in that position, right? Might makes right. And that is pagan morality. And that is the morality of abortion that we have today in America.
Was that the same morality then that moved in? Is it the same underlying morality or approach that also led to the shifts in marriage?
Well, I mean, in the sense of moral subjectivity, right?
Okay. Yeah.
That we are not going to accept these transcendent moral claims about the human person. That each person, is born with inherent dignity and a right to life and liberty in the pursuit of happiness, right?
Mm-hmm.
Including the unborn, made in the image of God. So equal in equal before God, and by law, equal in terms of their right to live, right? So with the marriage thing, what we see is again, with a pregnant mother, she's asserting her right to define who gets to, whether or not this person gets to live or die, just based on her whims, her desires, right? In the case of marriage, we have a situation where we're rejecting the objective definition of marriage and substituting for it this undefinable kind of squishy notion of dignity in marriage that requires us to destroy the institution of marriage, right? The gay marriage debate, the consequences of it, I argue in the book, will be the complete destruction of marriage in America, and we're starting to see that now. So it's not that like more people, that more people will get married now and like enjoy sort of like social acceptance for their union, which was what the rhetoric was during the gay marriage debate. It's that fewer and fewer people will get married at all because marriage will become discredited as an institution because it doesn't mean anything. And we will see the rise, and in the book I argue we are seeing the rise of polygamy and polyamory and these various arrangements that claim the mantle of marriage, but really bear no relation to it. So not just Mormon polygamists, right, making the same arguments as the proponents of gay marriage made, the exact same arguments, right, constitutionally on the same basis that we granted gay marriage, we have to grant religious polygamist marriages, but also completely non-religious secular polyamory, where you have these things called polycules of not just like one man with many wives, but like any combination of adults in like these polyamorous pods, some of which involve children, right, to their great harm and detriment, great risk. These arrangements being codified in law. That's happening right now. It's happening at the local level in certain towns in Massachusetts. It's happened in certain cases in New York City, certain court cases that have recognized these arrangements as legal arrangements. So again, we're through the looking glass here. If that is going to be marriage, well, marriage has lost all meaning, right?
Yeah. So you're saying like there's examples of houses where there's kids and they might have maybe their mom or something is involved in this, but there will be just multiple
other adults that are spouses and that are seeking legal recognition as such, right?
So like there might be 4, 6, 7 adults within this kind of some legal union, and the kids are somehow bound up to this.
Yes. Which of course puts the kids in
insanity.
grave danger, right, of abuse. People forget in the gay marriage debate, the reason that like there are laws around marriage is mostly for the protection and rearing and stability of the children that result from those marriages. That's the main reason that there has been an institution of marriage legally, right? Not just in America, but in other societies as well.
Because a government understands that that's the best way to produce kids, because it's a proven formula that's worked for a very long time.
Right.
One father, one mother, rear kids. It works. Stability, success.
And we know too that children in these other situations that are living in households of unrelated adults are at a much higher risk of abuse, neglect, sexual assault. It's just like objectively provable, that is the case, right? And so, but in the name of a radical moral subjectivity around the issue of marriage, and because we sort of lost the fight, right, over this. We are in a situation where there is no basis on which to deny these adults, legal recognition of their arrangements, right? Because if marriage is just going to be whatever, if love is love, right? Like
that's the sign, right? That's the one you put in your front yard.
Yeah. Right. Paraphrasing like the Obergefell decision, right? If love is love and whatever I acclaim as an individual, as like an autonomous individual who's free to sort of like create reality, right, by my own volition, then if I say that I'm married to like these 6 other people, then then the law must recognize that, So all that to say, and the purpose of discussing it in the book is to say, like, these things that sound crazy are going to happen in America. They're going to happen. There is no basis on which we can stop them from happening unless we return to what is now a discarded notion of Christian morality and its influence on the public square and public life in America.
So what's the thought process? Like legally, what's the thought process? Is, Greg, as you're talking about marriage, okay, so marriage makes sense, obviously from a theological standpoint, right? And it would just make a natural law, I guess, which is going to flow from that. So you're saying, okay, we know we have children and we know we need like these units, these family units. Theologically, it's always made sense, but naturally it makes sense. So as you're going through deciding things like this, like you're taking into account the sake of the children, right? That would be a natural part of it. As you're describing what's going on, are children even part of the conversation, or as they're making these rules and allowing these types of marriages? Like, are they even taking that into account, or are they just simply saying, well, we have to just let people do whatever the heck they want, and we have to be able to put a stamp of approval on that? Like, what's like, the philosophy that's leading to these kind of?
I think rather than these institutions being structured for the flourishment and propagation and stability of children, right? Right. Again, power deployed on behalf of the weak. This is a situation where we are saying children must endure the sexual preferences of adults and the consequences of that. So power deployed on behalf of the powerful for their sake, and the children are just. That's just something that they have to endure or survive as best they can for the sake of what the adults want, right, in the situation. So I to the extent that children are considered in these debates, they are just considered sort of a casualty of the desires of these adults to have these arrangements, and you see a rejection of what we had before, which was suborning the desires of the adults for the sake of stability of the society, the good of the children, right? And this was true, about our divorce laws, of the whole, it wasn't until the 1960s that we got no fault divorce, right? Prior to that, in American history, you couldn't just get a divorce for irreconcilable differences or whatever. There had to be a reason, an objective reason, to break up this marriage, because we understood that it was in all of our interests for marriages to be stable and for children to be raised in households with both a mother and a father.
Right. Nothing else makes sense. Nothing else makes sense. That has to be the reason why we recognize marriage in the first place.
Right.
And I wanted to mention earlier, we were this idea of positive versus negative freedoms, and that I'm sorry.
You just move the mic up a little bit.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
There you go. That looks good.
Good.
There you go.
Okay.
Bennett's
right.
over there waving his hands.
Okay.
Sorry. Keep going.
All right. Good. This idea of positive versus negative freedoms, that our Constitution doesn't say what you're allowed to do. Our Constitution says what government isn't allowed to do.
Right.
And we've always recognized that these core freedoms come from God. They don't come from government. And so it seems to me, and I think you make the point, in the book, that what we've been trying to do and what we've succeeded, sadly, in doing to some degree, is separating this idea that our freedoms come from God, and we're inverting that whole structure of positive versus negative freedom. And we're beginning to say, hey, here's what you can do now,
Mhm.
instead of saying you can do what you want and government can't do this. So I think the recognition of gay marriage is one of the things that goes hand in hand with that we're now saying, hey, you're allowed to do this now.
Like this is something the government can confer
right
on you.
Can
in other words,
bestow upon
the
you,
state is the source of this dignity, this recognition that you seek for your marriage, and it's up to the state to then require everyone else to recognize this as well as a marriage. And that's true. That was true for a long time about abortion until we got to Dobbs. That this was a right. You had the right to kill your unborn child, and the state was going to secure that right and really confer that upon you, right? Like created a right where none existed. So it's a huge problem, right? To say that our rights come from God, they're not created by the state. If you reject that and you say, well, our rights are created by the state, well, then there's no limit to the number of things that the state can now do to you, right? I mean, and you sort of back yourself into a tyrannical situation that way, because if the state can create rights, they can also like mandate all kinds of behaviors. They can mandate all kinds of speech. It didn't take long for us to go from, in the gay marriage debate, proponents of gay marriage saying like, we just want to be like accepted. We just want to be tolerated. Didn't take long to go from that to like bake the cake bigot, and Jack Phillips' never ending odyssey to try to vindicate his conscience rights, to just not speak, right? He just wanted to not have to endorse gay marriage. Jack Phillips, Baronet Stutzman, the 303 creative lady whose name I forget, all of these, and thankfully that was the 303 creative case sort of, decided that, but the problem's not going to go away. That's why I say in the book, like, if you want to know what like the future of pagan America looks like, it's a boot stamping on Jack Phillips' face forever, to paraphrase George Orwell. This is a problem that can only be solved by return to a previous way of understanding where our rights come from and what the role of the government is.
And what do you see? So obviously Dobbs returned these decisions to the states. What role do you see? I mean, in terms of federalism, how do you see state legislatures and courts being able to fix some of this?
I think it's going to be messy. And I think you're going to have a situation where some parts of the country are going to look totally different than other parts of the country. The abortion regime in California and New York is going to be totally different than the abortion regime in Texas and Florida. Maybe that's a good thing. I think we're sort of, we are already kind of two countries in a lot of ways. And I think that there's an opportunity for pro-life politicians and activists if they will take it, and they haven't done a good job about taking it up to this point. There's an opportunity to go beyond just saying Roe v. Wade was unconstitutional. We should send this back to the states. Well, we should send this back to the states to do what? Like, for what purpose should this be sent to the states? And I understand, this is a very, you could have a whole series of podcasts just on this one issue, right? It's very complex. And there's a lot of different, even on the pro-abortion side, there's a lot of different like approaches. You have the abolitionists who say this is a 14th Amendment issue, and incrementalists who are like, no, like let's, and then like total, just like cynics, like who pro-life posers who, like, for the sake of campaign donations, pretended to be against abortion. Yeah. But once Dobbs was passed, it was a clarifying moment, because you were able to see who actually takes this stuff seriously. And a lot of like establishment Republicans who had done a lot of fundraising about for pro-life, because they were pro-life Republicans, didn't have a lot to say about the issue after Dobbs, as though that solved it, and that there's nothing more to do on the issue. I think that leaning into the philosophical and theological claims of the pro-life movement to say, like, these are people, unborn children have a right to life, and if the best we can do is a 15-week ban in this state, then by God, we do a 15-week ban. If we can get a 6-week ban, then God willing, let's get a 6-week ban. And if by some miracle we can ban it outright and make it totally illegal, then let's do that. Let's go as far as we can with this, and let's lean into our convictions here. And I think that politically, I know there's a narrative out there that says like, oh, the American people aren't ready for that. The results of like the elections we've had since Dobbs have shown that governors who did lean into it and who did go after a 6-week heartbeat bill or a 12-week ban or something like that in Texas, Florida, Georgia, Tennessee, the governors who did that all won re-election in 2022 after Dobbs by like comfortable margins. And a lot of Republican candidates who didn't want to talk about the issue. I'm thinking of Oz in Pennsylvania. Bad candidate for a bunch of reasons, but he didn't want to talk about abortion after Dobbs. They lost. It's only in states where you've had these like really confusing referendums that are easily gamed by the left, where you had like referendums that failed, in red states, in Kansas and other places. So I think the lesson here is, to have the courage of your convictions. People are persuadable on this point, especially because the left has sort of, adopted what was inevitably always going to be their position, which is like, this is a positive good. Unborn children are no different than like slaves in the antebellum South. They can be discarded of with total impunity, and it's the constitutional right of every woman to do that. I think. I think it's a good bet to say that is a repulsive position to a lot of Americans who may not like think of themselves as pro-life, and there's a persuadable group there.
Well, I always love Peter. I think it was Peter Kreeft's quote where he says that sex is their God and abortion is their sacrament.
Yes,
which is why it uses the same words in the opposite meaning, right?
Yes.
This is my body. And you can see the way they protect that. If you can mention, in your book you were talking about, I think it was in Britain or the UK, there were 2 stories you gave that were just, they were mind-blowing. I haven't heard those stories before. And you were telling both of those. But just as a data point for, if you don't have to do these fights now, right, which this is one of those rare areas where you could still, to your point, you could still get victory in some states. A lot of these other things, we've already lost the first couple battles. So it doesn't mean we can't regroup, but we have to regroup. But what were some of those examples? And was it the UK?
Yeah, this is talking about how like the pagan state, what I call the pagan state, which is very, very different than the the American regime under the Constitution. Pagan state is a totally new regime, and like pagan empires of old, there's a certain unanimity that it requires of people when it comes to public or state morality. And we have to remember, in the pagan world, religion and morality were separate, right? There were all kinds of different religious practices in the Roman Empire, but there was only one state morality, and that was Caesar is God, and you will offer incense to him, right? Whatever you believe, whatever your religious rites are, whatever pagan gods or practices you have, are of no concern to the state. What the state is concerned about is unanimity and uniformity in public morality, right? And that's how paganism has always worked, right? And the reason for that is that paganism isn't just a series of cosmological claims; it's a system. It's a political system that has a certain power dynamic that's used to control people, right? Christianity, for the first time, united morality and religion. What the religion claimed determined the morality of the people, right? So in a post-Christian America, we are returning to this pagan separation of religion and morality, where religion can be whatever you want it to be in private. We don't care, but you will offer a pinch of incense to Caesar. You must offer a pinch of incense to Caesar. And so dissent on things like abortion, the greatest pagan sacrament, is not going to be allowed. Like, you must perform the public morality on abortion, right? And performing the morality, like in ancient Rome, it was they would plead with Christians, just symbolically put a pinch of incense on the altar to Caesar, and we won't have to kill you. Like, you don't have to believe it. It's just, you just have to perform it, because we need to have unanimity when it comes to the state morality. And of course, the Christians wouldn't do it, and it became a huge problem, and eventually toppled the empire, right? Because it broke the pagan stranglehold over morality, and it exposed the pagan system as fatally weak and corrupt, and it exposed the atrocities that were at the heart of it and the barbarity that was at the heart of it. So what we have now in the examples that you cited in the United Kingdom and in other places in Europe, we're starting to see these laws come on the books prohibiting any kind of protest within a certain distance of abortion clinics. And this includes silent prayer. So it's illegal in many parts of the United Kingdom right now to stand within 100 yards or whatever of an abortion clinic and pray silently. And if you do that, and the police encounter you and they ask you if you're praying and you say yes, they'll arrest you and take you away in handcuffs. And this happened to the head of a pro-life group in the United Kingdom, and they filmed it. You know,
it was a lady, right?
It was a woman. Yeah, it's happened to her more than once. It happened to her priest as well. Her Catholic priest was arrested for the same charges. And of course, it's very interesting. You get it, you know, they had criminal charges filed against them for violating this ordinance. And of course, the priest, one of his defenses was, I am called to pray always. I'm always praying. So does that mean when I'm driving through a part of town that's within a certain distance of an abortion clinic, I have to cease my prayers, my constant prayers? You know, so the idea that you would have a regime that criminalizes silent prayer,
thought crime,
that's a tyranny. That's a tyrannical regime. Right. That is, and the reason they're doing it is because they are demanding, just as the pagan empires did it in the past, they're demanding unanimity and uniformity on this performance of this state morality, which is that no word can be spoken against abortion and no thought can be thought against abortion. And certainly no prayers can be offered against abortion. And to me, this is one of those moments where it's like, it's obviously not widely reported in the corporate press for obvious reasons, but it's one of these moments where like the new pagan order kind of reveals itself, and the contours of what that would look like begin to be visible. It was shocking to me to learn about this too, but it's very real.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think one of the key things for the listener is you talked about for those early Christians, right? Put a little bit of incense. You don't have to believe it, you know, do it to Caesar and we'll let you go and everything will be just fine, right? That's the narrative. And the key is, you said they didn't do it, mm-hmm. right? They wouldn't even do that.
Right.
And because they weren't willing to, because they did not do that and submit in that way, that's how they broke the pagan empire. Mm-hmm. And that's how Christianity conquered, right? Mm-hmm. That little bit of strength. I mean, it takes a lot of fortitude, but that is what allowed Christianity to win, right? Of course, via the Holy Spirit and through Christ's lordship. But now you go today, and I think the numbers in the Catholic Church are like 55%. It's like 46% in the LCMS, and then you go to some of the other ones, and it's like 70-80% are pro-abortion rights, right? Yeah. Until you can get that number close to 100%, right? Which is probably a good marker of what the real Christians are, mm-hmm. right? And until Christians can make those kind of stands and say, well, I'm certainly not going to even support and say I'm pro-choice, mm-hmm. but also I'm willing to do what this lady did, right? I'm willing to be arrested. I'm not going to put the incense. I'm not going to nod towards these types of secular pagan things that are being pushed. Mm-hmm. That's when the church will regain its strength. Mm-hmm. And that's when it will be able to push back, and you're able to then push back with proper light.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be a much smaller church too, because all those shocking percentages of self-identifying Christians who accept things like gay marriage and abortion, eventually those people are just going to leave. Mm-hmm. like leave the formal practice of Christianity altogether. And many of them have, especially in the Catholic Church, there's a lot of people who say they're Catholic. They don't go to mass, mm-hmm. right? They don't have, their morality is sort of indistinguishable from like modern paganism, you know? And so like, that's what we were talking about earlier, about a smaller but more potent church, a smaller mm-hmm. but more faithful church, a church that as then Cardinal Ratzinger says has lost its privileges, and has lost its status, will be much smaller. His view, this was in 1969, he said this, his view was that the church appeared to be the true church appeared, he's talking about the Catholic Church, appeared to be much larger than it really was, that it was actually a much smaller church. And it had these empty forms and empty outward institutions and trappings that made it seem like it was much bigger and more influential than it really was. And I think that's true across all of the other Christian denominations as well.
So what do you think about when the church tries to appease those people?
It's a huge mistake. It's not loving either. When you love someone, you tell them the truth, and so it's not loving to lie to people about the truth, especially. And that's what too many pastors and too many, especially in the evangelical world, have done to try to appear winsome or to try to appear tolerant, and have sort of, spoken very, very confusingly and very vaguely about really important questions when it comes to abortion or homosexuality or even the transgender issue in an effort to be compassionate. It's a huge mistake because it sows confusion. And that's what we're seeing, especially right now, like I said, in the evangelical churches.
Yeah, because it seems like it becomes a big distraction. To your point of, I'm picturing Gideon, right? With you got all these men, and then God kind of whittles it down to the 300, and then works victory through that. You're going to see the same things with Lord of the Rings, right? As you kind of get this last final stand where you've got, it almost looks like the 300, men as they go up to the Black Gate, right? But there's this strength in this united and unified kind of attack plan or game plan, moving forward. And I think the church gets so distracted in that we so often spend all of our time not worrying about any of this kind of paganization or this moral degradation that's all around us and within us and all of this kind of stuff. And we just say, well, let's not do that. But really what we want to do is we need to worry about those people that are really confused, and we just need to be really nice to them. So that's what all of our effort for the next 5 years on being really nice to them and getting some kind of
making them feel welcome.
Yeah. And maybe we'll get some new music that will catch them, and that'll trick them into coming in here. And we spend all of our effort doing that, and we spend none of our effort actually worrying about the wolf at the door.
Right.
And so all we're doing is spinning our wheels. And then in the process, we're actually being, I think, proselytized by the pagans around us.
Yeah.
And certainly that happens within the church institutions. And it's reading through your book and reading these things, if you can just get that unified church body, right? If all the fat goes away, who are the ones that are really saying Christ is Lord, right? Kind of like the early church.
And this is the truth. And there's ways to speak the truth with compassion and with love. On the question of something like gay marriage or homosexuality, there's no question that people who find themselves with a same-sex attraction that is persistent and consistent in their lives, that's a tough deal for them, and it means they're going to have a harder life. But you can be honest with someone about that, and you can still speak the truth to them, and you can still speak the truth while also recognizing this is a cross that you have to bear, and we'll help you bear it. But it means your life is going to be hard in a way that it's not hard for other people. That doesn't change what the truth is, though. The truth is what it is. All Christians are called to practice chastity, right? And that means sex within marriage, only one man and one woman. That is the only context in which Christians are supposed to be sexually active, and that is just the truth. And you cannot run from that. If you deny that, if you equivocate on that, the house of cards is going to come down, because you lose your moral authority, and you lose your credibility too. And to lose that for the sake of just wanting people to feel better is not loving toward them. It's not only is it just a bad idea to do that, you'd be tactically, right? If you're trying to win back the culture, but it's totally unfair to the person who is struggling with this. It doesn't help them at all. And it doesn't show compassion or understanding about their situation. And so, I think about it the same way, like you think about like your loved ones or your family, sometimes you have to tell them the truth, even if it's tough, but you do it because you love them. That's what love is. Love isn't just telling people what they want to hear so that you feel better. And that's, we see too much of that in the church across all the denominations.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think, Greg?
I think love is not ice cream at every meal.
Yeah, it's a good way to put it.
Yeah, right.
Sometimes it's lentils.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I agree. I think we talked about this yesterday a little bit too. That in the effort to bring people in, you're actually turning people away. Because if the church isn't a rock, if church is the one thing that you don't want to change over time, and if you throw that away and you change it with the shifting politics or whatever it is, yeah, you're doing a disservice to your congregation, no question. So yeah.
So let's hit the one last one. If you can just kind of walk us through this chapter, which I'd never really thought about, but this kind of connection between transgenderism and maybe some of the dangers there, and kind of lean into that, but then also how that plays into this pedophilia, right? And how the very same logic is allowing both things to take place, which of course no one wants to think about, as you said.
Sure.
Very diabolical, but
Sure. So, and I want to be clear too that what I am not saying that the connection is not that all transgender people are also pedophiles.
Right. Yeah.
So that's not the argument. The argument is that on the basis that we justify transgender ideology and affirm transgenderism, like in our schools and for young people, and in the medical establishment with like gender affirming care, the basis on which we do that, like the philosophical basis, is the same basis on which pedophiles are going to be able to justify their pedophilia, and we see that most obviously in the way the transgender movement uses consent, right? This idea of consent. It used to be that we prohibited certain things, not because, not on the basis of consent, right? But on the basis to an appeal to objective moral reality, right? That certain things were wrong, and we can use our reason to know they are wrong, and so we prohibit them in law, right? The shift that we see within like the transgender sort of like movement or the transgender debates, right, is that as long as there's consent, then this stuff should be allowed. And I'm thinking specifically with regards to minors, right? And this is the kind of debate. Sometimes you take a step back and you're like, how are we even talking about
what are we
this?
talking about?
What are we talking about this?
Right.
But what we're talking about is, just to use clear language about it and to call it what it is, we're talking about sterilization, castration, mutilation of children, right? Who in the name of this gender ideology that purports that you can, if you're a boy, you can become a girl, or not that you can just become a girl, that you really are a girl. And there's this disconnection between your identity and your body. And so you have to modify your body to match your identity. In some ways, it's a very Gnostic kind of philosophy. But the justification for allowing these things to be done to children is that the children are consenting to it, and not only are they consenting to it, but we have to do this for their health. Like if we don't allow them to have access to gender affirming care and to go on like puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones and get a double mastectomy or to be castrated. And I hate to even talk about this stuff, right? Because it's stomach turning, but it's real, it's happening. So we have to talk about it. And the connection with pedophilia is simply this, that if a 12-year-old can consent to getting a double mastectomy or to being permanently sterilized, there's not much that a 12-year-old can't consent to, right? On what basis are you going to say that a 12-year-old can consent to these medical procedures, but can't consent to sexual relations with an older person, right? It doesn't make any sense. It's not reasonable. It's not rational. But again, pagan morality disfigures reason. Reason belongs to Christianity. It belongs to a Christian worldview and a transcendent moral order that coheres, right? And we're used to, as Christians and as just Westerners, we're used to like worldviews and moral systems that cohere, right? Because that's our inheritance from Christianity. But the pagan moral order does not cohere, right? Because it's based on these things we've been talking about: force and will and coercion. And so it can change. There can be, it's relative, right? Power is relative. And so the basis on which we as a society are justifying gender affirming care for minors is the same basis that academics in academia right now, and I go through this in the book, are working to justify pedophilia. And of course, they don't call it pedophilia, just like the transgender advocates don't call it castration or mutilation. They call it gender affirming care. They have these euphemisms. The pedophile advocates call it minor attracted persons, or MAPS, right? That's how they talk. That's the jargon that they have, because of course pedophile has negative connotations, and they don't want to they view pedophiles as the victims here. They are stigmatized. We need to recognize their identities, right? So you can see where this is going. It's very familiar territory by now. We need to recognize
this is who they are.
Unchosen sexual orientation, and that so that they're non-offending pedophiles, right? It's not that hard to jump from there to a world in which a pedophile comes forward with their underage lover and says, our union, our relationship is consensual. It is a persistent and deep part of both of our identities. And we demand that our identities be affirmed and recognized and decriminalized. And they're going to argue that on the same basis that the transgender movement argued for their identities to be recognized, on the same basis that the gay marriage advocates argued for their marriages to be recognized and their identities to be recognized. And there is, with our current moral framework and understanding of public morality and law, cannot stop that from happening. That is going to happen. So again, part of why I wrote the book was to get people to wrap their minds around this and start thinking about it seriously. If you're against that, even if you're not like a super on fire Christian or a super conservative, if you're against that, you need to start thinking about how we got to this point and what it is that we can do to stop this from happening. How do we go back? Where did we go wrong? Right? Think back. How did this become inevitable? These atrocities, these abominations, frankly. How is it that we're having these debates? And where do we go from here? I think a lot of people are not there. They just do not accept what is happening and what's going to happen. And I'm trying to get them to accept that. And so I'm not giving them a program for how to save America, because that's not the purpose of the book. A lot of books like this will end with these 10 steps and you can save America. I don't end on that note, because the task at hand, I think, is to get people to accept what's happening.
Let me just read, because that was one of my favorite asks. So this is how you end. So you say, but we are called to fight and die if we must. In the words of Boniface, who you talked about, Boniface.
St. Boniface, yeah.
Yeah, great example. Who was himself martyred, cut down by a pagan raider. Let us continue the fight on the day of the Lord. The days of anguish and of tribulation have overtaken us. If God so wills, let us die for the holy laws of our fathers, so that we may deserve to obtain an eternal inheritance with them. Let us be neither dogs that do not bark, nor silent onlookers, nor paid servants who run away before the wolf. Instead, let us be careful shepherds watching over Christ's flock. We need barking dogs and shepherds now more than ever. The wolves are coming. That's the end of the book.
Yeah. Most of that was a quote from St. Boniface himself.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
My lines were at the end, that we need shepherds and, now more than ever. And we need to be dogs that are barking, because the wolves are coming. The wolves are coming and the wolves are here.
So this is what they're pushing for. This is the things that you.
This is the world they are bringing into being in America. And so we need to be realistic about that.
And the thesis is it's either that or it's a real return to Christianity. Not Christianity light, but a real return to a Christian way of thinking and ordering your families, your lives, and your society.
This is why I took a great quote from one of G.K. Chesterton's letters as my epigraph for the book. He said, and I'm paraphrasing him, but he said, people say you cannot return to the past, but the way forward diverges into two roads, both of which lead us back into the past. Either we return to some sort of Catholic fellowship or we return to some sort of pagan slavery. There is no third road. And that's the claim of the book.
Well, let's go ahead and pause. And I say pause because we've got another episode coming up. We're going to release it next week. We've got a lot more to talk about on this that I'm really excited to, especially diving into a little bit of this with Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and some of the things that they saw coming is what we're seeing. And I think seeing those kind of prophetic eyes or prophetic kind of visions that they were having is quite helpful. So, John, thank you. Greg, thanks for swinging by. That was great.
Absolutely.
I appreciate that.
Glad to be part of this.
And for all of those watching, we'll continue this next week. God bless.